Welcome to my channel, Scarewave Tales. Story 1. The wind howled through the cracks of the old house, as if the building itself was exhaling its last breath. The night was unusually dark, with clouds swallowing the moon, and the surrounding forest stood in oppressive silence. Emily pulled her coat tighter around her as she stepped onto the creaking porch. She hesitated, clutching the brass key she had inherited along with the dilapidated mansion from an uncle she barely remembered. The place reeked of decay and abandonment, but something in her gut told her it was more than just the years of neglect. She pushed the door open, and it groaned loudly, as though warning her not to enter. Dust swirled in the beam of her flashlight as her footsteps echoed on the warped wooden floors. The air felt thick, pressing against her chest, making it harder to breathe. Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She fumbled to check the screen, but the message was blank, no sender, no content, just a notification she couldn't dismiss. She shrugged it off and chalked it up to a glitch, even as unease prickled the back of her neck. The house was eerily cold, the kind of cold that felt alive, crawling under her skin. She walked into the foyer, where a massive mirror hung on the wall, its surface so dusty that her reflection seemed like a shadow of herself. She paused, feeling an inexplicable pull toward it. As she wiped at the grime with her sleeve, she gasped. The reflection didn't match her movements. Her hand froze, but in the mirror, her reflection continued to move, raising its hand and pressing it against the glass. Emily stumbled back, her heart pounding. The reflection mouthed something, words she couldn't hear, but the meaning was clear. Leave. Ignoring the chill racing up her spine, she turned away from the mirror and hurried deeper into the house, convincing herself it was a trick of her imagination. She had to find the source of the strange noises she'd heard earlier, the faint whispers that had drawn her here in the first place. The hallway stretched on longer than it should have, with doors on either side, all slightly ajar. Each one seemed to beckon her, but she kept her focus on the end of the corridor, where a faint glow emanated from under a door. As she approached, the whispers grew louder, but they weren't just whispers, they were voices, layered and overlapping, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. It was icy to the touch, and for a moment, she thought she heard someone breathing on the other side. She pushed the door open, and the light immediately went out, plunging her into darkness. Her flashlight flickered and then died, leaving her in pitch blackness. Panic set in as she felt something move in the room with her. The air shifted, carrying with it a faint scent of rot and something metallic, like blood. Emily froze, her senses hyper-aware. A sound broke the silence, a wet, dragging noise that sent a jolt of terror through her. She fumbled for her phone, using its faint glow to light the room. The beam revealed an old rocking chair in the corner, swaying slowly on its own. Her breath hitched as she realized it wasn't empty. A figure sat there, its face obscured by shadows, but its eyes, milky white and unblinking, bore into her. The whispers returned louder now, and they came from the figure. It leaned forward, its skeletal hand reaching out toward her. Emily stumbled back, tripping over something soft. She scrambled to her feet and shone the phone's light down. It was a pile of photographs scattered across the floor, all of her. Each photo showed her in different stages of her life, from childhood to the present, but the last one made her stomach churn. It was of her standing in this very room, taken just moments ago. Her heart raced as she felt hot breath against her neck. Spinning around, she found nothing but empty air. The door slammed shut, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, drowning out her screams. Suddenly, everything stopped. Silence. Stillness. The door creaked open slightly, and she bolted, her mind screaming at her to get out. She raced down the hallway, but the house seemed to twist and shift around her. The exit was no longer where she had come in, replaced by more endless corridors. She shouted for help, but her voice sounded small and insignificant, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. She turned a corner and froze. The mirror from the foyer was now in the middle of the hallway, and her reflection was no longer hers. The figure in the mirror smiled at her, a cold, sinister smile, and stepped out of the glass, leaving her paralyzed with fear as it advanced toward her, whispering, "You should have listened." Emily's legs felt like lead, but her mind screamed at her to move. The figure emerging from the mirror was no longer confined to the glass. Its presence seemed to consume the space around her. Shadows clung to it like living tendrils, distorting the air. She forced herself to stumble backward, her breath shallow, her heartbeat deafening in her ears. The whispers returned, now intelligible, yet maddeningly cryptic. "Stay, or leave, there is no escape." The hallway behind her warped as she fled, the doors on either side slamming shut, one after another, as if the house itself were trying to trap her. She reached the staircase, its banister splintered and unwelcoming, but she had no other choice. She descended quickly, the old wood groaning under her weight. Halfway down, the stairs seemed to stretch, each step elongating impossibly, forcing her to leap toward the landing. At the bottom, she found herself in the foyer again, though it wasn't the same. The mirror was gone, replaced by a painting of a family she didn't recognize, parents and two children. Their faces were partially obscured, but their eyes looked just like the milky, unblinking gaze of the figure upstairs. As she stared, the children in the painting began to move, turning their heads slowly toward her. She stumbled back, knocking over a side table. The crash echoed like thunder, but the children's whispers were louder. "It's too late now." Emily's instincts screamed at her to leave the house, but the front door, though visible, felt impossibly far away. She sprinted toward it, her steps echoing like gunshots. Just as she reached for the handle, the door vanished, replaced by cold, unyielding stone. A shiver ran down her spine as the sound of footsteps approached from behind her. She turned slowly, her body trembling, to see the figure from the mirror standing at the base of the stairs, its hand extended, pointing toward her, and the whispers became a single voice, low and guttural. "You belong to us." Her phone buzzed again. She fumbled to check it, desperate for a distraction, a connection to the world outside. This time, the screen displayed a single message: "Run." Without thinking, she turned and darted down a side hallway, her path illuminated only by the dim glow of her phone. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls seemed to close in around her. She reached a door she hadn't noticed before, its surface carved with strange symbols. Without hesitation, she pushed it open and entered. The room was circular, its walls lined with shelves holding ancient, tattered books. A single candle burned in the center, its flame unnaturally steady. The whispers here were different, softer, almost pleading. Emily approached the candle, her eyes drawn to the flickering light. As she reached out to touch, she spun around to see a man standing in the doorway, his clothes tattered, his face gaunt and pale. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "I've been trapped here for years," he said, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "They don't let you leave. Not once you've touched the mirror." Emily's mind raced. "The mirror? What is it? What's happening to me?" The man stepped closer, his movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. "It's a gateway," he said, "but not to anywhere you'd want to go. The house feeds on you. Your fears, your memories. It turns them into..." He stopped abruptly, his eyes widening. "They're coming." The candle flickered for the first time, and the room seemed to shudder. The man grabbed her arm. "We have to go. Now." Together, they fled the room, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. The house twisted around them, doors and hallways appearing and disappearing at random. Emily could feel the presence behind her, growing closer with every step. "Where are we going?" she shouted. "To the attic," the man replied, his voice strained. "It's the only way." They reached the staircase again, but this time it spiraled upward, higher than the house should have allowed. The man pushed her ahead of him. "Climb," he yelled. Emily didn't argue, her legs burning as she ascended. The attic was a cavernous space, filled with cobwebs and broken furniture. In the center stood another mirror, this one larger and more ornate than the first. Its surface shimmered like water, and Emily could see her reflection, but it wasn't her. It was a younger version of herself, her face pale and frightened. The man grabbed her shoulders. "This is your chance," he said. "If you can pass through, you might be able to leave. But you have to be willing to let go of everything. Your fears, your regrets, your past. They're what keep you here." Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She could feel the darkness closing in, the house itself tightening its grip on her. The whispers became a cacophony, screaming at her to stop, to turn back, to stay. Taking a deep breath, she stepped toward the mirror. The surface rippled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the glass. It was cold, almost painfully so. She closed her eyes and pushed forward. Emily felt the cold surface of the mirror give way beneath her hand, like plunging into icy water. A jolt of panic shot through her as her breath hitched. Her body sucked forward against her will. The world around her twisted, the air rippling like waves as she stumbled into a realm of shadow and light. She landed on what felt like solid ground, though it seemed to pulse beneath her feet. She glanced back, hoping to see the attic, the man who had urged her to escape. But the mirror had vanished, replaced by an endless void. She was no longer in the house, yet its oppressive energy lingered. The air was thick with a low, vibrating hum that settled in her chest. Shapes moved in the distance, vague, formless figures that seemed to flicker between solidity and nothingness. She held up her phone, its faint glow barely piercing the darkness. The screen was blank now, the message gone, but the light gave her a sense of direction, however fragile. She took a cautious step forward. The ground beneath her shifted again, and she nearly fell as it morphed into a narrow path, winding through the void like a thread of faint light. She followed it, her footsteps echoing as if she were walking through a cavern. The whispers returned, faint at first, then louder. She couldn't make out their words, but they seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the voices of the house that followed her here. A figure appeared on the path ahead, a small girl in a tattered white dress, her hair matted and covering her face. Emily froze. The girl stood motionless, her head tilted as if listening to something. Slowly, Emily raised her phone's light toward her, but the girl vanished, reappearing an instant later much closer. Emily gasped, stumbling back. "Who are you?" Emily managed, her voice trembling. The girl didn't respond. Instead, she raised an arm and pointed off the path into the void. Emily's gaze followed the gesture, and she saw something glimmering in the distance, a faint silvery light. When she looked back, the girl was gone, leaving only the faint scent of decay behind. Against her better judgment, Emily left the path, moving toward the light. The ground became uneven, shifting with each step, as though it resisted her movement. The whispers grew louder, forming words now. "Turn back. Turn back." Emily gritted her teeth and pressed on, the light growing brighter as she approached. The source of the glow was a door, ornate, ancient, and completely out of place in the void. Symbols carved into its surface seemed to shift and writhe as she looked at them. A chill ran down her spine as she reached for the handle, which was warm to the touch, pulsing like a heartbeat. She pushed it open and stepped through. She was back in the house, but it wasn't the same. The walls were no longer cracked and decayed. Instead, they gleamed with fresh paint, and the air smelled of polish and flowers. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm light on the polished wood floors. For a moment, Emily thought she had escaped. Then she saw the family. They were seated in the dining room, the same family from the painting. A man, a woman, and 2 children. Their faces were clearer now, but their eyes were still wrong, milky white and lifeless. They turned to her in unison, their movements too smooth, too synchronized. The woman stood first, her mouth stretching into a grotesque smile. "Welcome home," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Emily backed away, her heart pounding. I don't belong here," she stammered. The man stood next, his head tilting at an unnatural angle. "You always belonged here." The children rose together, their hands clasped, and began to chant in unison. The words were incomprehensible, but their tone was heavy, menacing. The walls of the room began to darken, the light draining away as shadows crept in from every corner. Emily turned and ran, her shoes slipping on the polished floor. The house twisted around her again, the corridors multiplying and folding in on themselves. She could hear the family behind her, their footsteps echoing as they pursued her. Their voices called out, growing distorted and shrill. She burst into a room and slammed the door shut behind her, pressing her weight against it. Her breathing was ragged, her body trembling. She turned to face the room and froze. It was filled with mirrors. Every surface, from the walls to the ceiling, was covered in them, reflecting her terrified expression back at her 100-fold. But not all the reflections were hers. In the mirrors closest to her, she saw the figure from before, the one that had stepped out of the first mirror. It smiled at her, its face splitting unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. The whispers rose to a deafening roar as the mirrors began to crack, one by one. Emily clutched her chest as the roar of shattering glass filled the room. The mirrors cracked in rapid succession, sending fractures skittering across their surfaces like jagged lightning bolts. In the fragmented reflections, the grinning figure multiplied, its twisted smile staring at her from countless angles. She tried to steady her breathing, but the air felt heavy, suffocating. The reflections began to move independently, the shards of glass rearranging themselves like pieces of a puzzle. Each fragment revealed glimpses of things that shouldn't exist. A woman sobbing in a corner, her skin peeling away. A child crawling across the ceiling with limbs bent at impossible angles. A figure cloaked in shadow, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. Emily, a voice whispered, soft but sharp, like a blade scraping against stone. She spun around, searching for the source. It was everywhere and nowhere, the sound bouncing off the broken glass. Her name echoed again, louder this time, as if the house itself was calling to her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her back to the present. She yanked it out with trembling hands. The screen was alive with static. Then a single message appeared. Do not turn around. Her heart stopped. She could feel it, something behind her. A presence so palpable it made the hairs on her neck stand on end. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of breathing, raspy and uneven, reached her ears. Emily's instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. Slowly, she glanced at the cracked mirrors. In their jagged reflections, she saw it, a towering figure looming behind her, its form shifting and writhing like smoke trapped in a jar. It had no face, only an empty void where its features should have been. The figure moved closer, its shadow stretching across the floor. Emily clenched her fists, forcing herself to move. She lunged for the door, twisting the knob frantically. It wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" she screamed, pounding on the wood. The mirrors began to tremble, the fractures widening as if the glass itself was alive. The figure's shadow slid along the walls, creeping toward her like spilled ink. The glass finally gave way, exploding outward in a shower of shards. Emily ducked, shielding her face as the fragments rained down. When she looked up, the figure was gone, and the room had transformed. It was no longer the mirror room. She was standing in what appeared to be a grand hall, its high ceilings adorned with ornate chandeliers. The walls were lined with portraits, each one depicting a different member of the family she'd seen at the dining table. Their expressions were solemn, their eyes following her as she moved. At the center of the hall stood a massive staircase, its steps carpeted in deep red. The sound of faint music drifted from above. A haunting melody played on an out-of-tune piano. It was familiar, but she couldn't place it. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. "Find the piano. Time is running out." Emily hesitated. The thought of climbing that staircase, of walking deeper into the house's clutches, filled her with dread. But what choice did she have? The whispers had stopped, and the house was eerily quiet now, as if waiting to see what she would do. The steps creaked beneath her weight as she ascended, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. The music grew louder, its dissonance making her skin crawl. When she reached the top, she found herself in another corridor, lined with doors that stretched endlessly in both directions. The music was coming from the left. Emily followed it, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She passed door after door, each one identical. Heavy oak with brass handles. Some were slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of impossible rooms. An overgrown garden under a blood-red sky. A library where books floated in midair. A nursery filled with broken toys. At the end of the corridor, she found the source of the music. A grand piano, sitting in the middle of a circular room. The instrument was covered in dust, its keys yellowed with age. Yet it played on its own, the keys moving as if guided by invisible hands. Emily approached cautiously, the floor beneath her vibrating with each note. On the piano's bench sat a sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle. She picked it up and read the words scrawled across it in messy handwriting. Play the song, and the door will open. But beware what follows. The piano stopped abruptly, the silence more unsettling than the music had been. Emily's reflection stared back at her from the glossy black surface of the piano lid. Except, it wasn't her reflection. It was smiling. Her phone buzzed. Another message. Do not play the song. Emily's hands trembled as she set the paper down. The room felt smaller now, the air pressing in around her. She glanced back at the corridor, but the way she had come was gone, replaced by a solid wall. The piano began to play again, but this time, it was different. The melody was slower, darker, each note resonating deep in her chest. She backed away, but the music followed her, growing louder and louder until it was all she could hear. Stop, she shouted, covering her ears. The music ceased instantly, and the room plunged into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, she was no longer alone. A figure sat at the piano, its back to her. It was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, its posture unnaturally stiff. Slowly, it turned its head, revealing a face that was wrong in every possible way, its features distorted, as if seen through warped glass. The figure stood, its movements jerky and unnatural. Emily stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. The figure raised a hand, pointing at the piano. Its mouth opened, and though no sound came out, Emily understood its command. Play. The old mansion had been abandoned for over 30 years, its walls now covered in thick ivy, its windows shattered from years of neglect. The townspeople had long whispered rumors about the place. Whispers about the strange deaths, about the family that had once lived there and disappeared without a trace. No one in the small town dared to go near it, and even the bravest souls who tried to explore it had never returned. But then came Marcus. He was a journalist from the city, bored with the humdrum of typical assignments. He sought something bigger, something with a story. When he heard the rumors about the mansion, he knew it was the perfect subject for his next article. No one had dared to investigate it, and if he could uncover the truth about what happened there, it would be the story of a lifetime. He arrived on a late afternoon, the sun sinking behind dark clouds. The air was thick and oppressive, and a chill swept over him as he approached the gates. The mansion loomed ahead, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. The place seemed almost to breathe, as though it were alive, waiting for something or someone. Marcus stepped through the rusted iron gates, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The mansion looked even more menacing up close, its towering, crumbling facade like the skull of a long-dead giant. The windows were dark, hollow eyes that seemed to follow his every move. He could feel a strange pull, an eerie sense that the house was aware of him, observing him. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the front door. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty hall. Dust swirled in the air, and the smell of decay hit him like a wave. His heart began to race, but he forced himself to step inside. As he moved further into the mansion, the silence was almost deafening. It was a dead silence, one that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He pulled out his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, revealing faded wallpaper peeling from the walls and old furniture covered in sheets. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The mansion seemed to stretch on forever, corridors twisting and turning, leading nowhere, or maybe to places better left undiscovered. It felt like the house was never meant to be explored, like it was built to trap people, to keep them from uncovering its secrets. Then, just as he was about to reach the grand staircase, he heard it, a low, guttural sound. At first, Marcus thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, the creaking of the old house settling in the wind. But then it came again, louder this time, like a growl. His blood ran cold. He froze, staring into the darkness at the top of the stairs. The noise was unmistakable now. It was coming from above. He debated whether to turn back. The feeling of dread was overwhelming, a presence in the air that seemed to weigh on him, urging him to leave. But he couldn't, not when he was so close to the heart of the mystery. He had to find out what had happened here. He took the first step up the staircase, and the growling sound stopped, replaced by an eerie, hollow whisper. The voice was indistinct, like a chorus of murmurs echoing through the house. The words were foreign, unintelligible, but there was a certain urgency to them, a desperation. It made his stomach churn. "Who's there?" Marcus called, his voice shaky. No answer, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though they were beckoning him. Marcus took another step, then another, until he reached the top. The hallway stretched before him, lined with closed doors. A cold draft whispered through the cracks, and the air felt thick, like something was watching him, something that did not want him there. He reached for the nearest door, his fingers trembling as he gripped the handle. The wood was rotting, the door frame cracked, but it opened with a low groan. The room beyond was dark, the air stale with the scent of mildew and decay. He shined his flashlight around, revealing a room filled with old furniture, a broken mirror, and something on the floor. Marcus knelt down, heart pounding. What he saw sent a shiver down his spine. The floor was stained with something dark, a thick, reddish-black liquid that seemed to have pooled in the center of the room. It was almost like blood, but not quite. It had an odd, oily sheen to it, like it had been there for years. He recoiled, wiping his mouth to keep from gagging. And then he saw it, a symbol, carved into the floor, surrounding the dark pool. Was an intricate symbol, one he didn't recognize, but something about it made his skin crawl. It was ancient, its lines twisted and contorted, as if it had been scratched by something desperate, something that had no hands to hold a tool. Marcus's flashlight flickered, casting the room into momentary darkness. He looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of the power outage. But when the light came back on, he found himself face to face with something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood at the far end of the room, in the doorway of the next chamber. It was tall, too tall, and it was dressed in a black, tattered cloak that hung to the ground. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Marcus could feel its eyes that were watching him, burning into him. "Who are you?" Marcus managed to croak, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate. Marcus could hear the rustling of its cloak, the sound oddly muffled, as if the air around it was thick, heavy with something he couldn't name. The growl returned, deeper this time, almost like a low hum that vibrated through the floor and into his bones. The figure raised a hand, and Marcus's flashlight flickered once more. In that brief moment, he saw something that made his stomach twist in terror. The figure's hand was not human. It was long, skeletal, with fingers that ended in jagged claws. A horrified gasp escaped Marcus's lips as he staggered backward, but the figure stepped forward, its eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. "No," Marcus whispered, his legs trembling beneath him. This can't be real." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached forward, and a strange force seemed to grip Marcus's chest, lifting him off the ground. He struggled, gasping for air, but the pressure on his chest only increased. His vision blurred as the figure pulled him toward it, the shadows surrounding him growing darker, more suffocating. "Let me go," Marcus cried out, but the figure only tightened its grip. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the symbol on the floor, glowing faintly in the dark, as though it were alive. Marcus awoke to the sound of dripping. The rhythmic sound reverberated around him, loud in the suffocating silence. His chest was tight, as if an invisible weight had settled on him. His throat felt dry, raw. He couldn't remember the last time he'd breathed easily. He opened his eyes slowly, expecting to see the dim outline of the room where he had last been. The old mansion, the strange figure. But as his vision cleared, the horror of his situation became apparent. He was no longer in the room. He heard a low hum, faint but growing in intensity. It was coming from the far corner of the room, where a dark figure stood. It was taller than a man, its form outlined in the faint glow of the candles. For a moment, Marcus thought it was just another figment of his imagination, but the figure's outline shifted slightly, like it was moving. "Who, what are you?" Marcus whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it shifted its position, stepping forward slowly, deliberately. It seemed to glide rather than walk, its form fluid, shifting in and out of clarity. The shadows around it clung to it like a cloak, an unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow up the light. Marcus's heart thudded painfully in his chest as he stumbled backward, his hands searching frantically for something, anything, that might protect him. His hand brushed against something cold and hard, a stone table. Its surface was covered in ancient dust, but it held a peculiar symbol, matching the ones etched into the walls. His fingers tingled as they traced the edges of the mark, and as they did, he felt a sudden jolt of energy pulse through his body. He recoiled, his breathing shallow. The energy was overwhelming, almost suffocating, and he could hear a voice, faint, like a whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't a voice he could recognize, but it sounded old, ancient even. The words weren't clear, but he could feel them pressing against his mind, trying to make him understand something terrible. Escape, escape or die. The words echoed in his ears, and his skin prickled with cold. He had to get out of there. He scrambled to his feet, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. He staggered, his body trembling as he tried to make his way toward the exit. But as he moved, the air grew thicker, heavier, and the hum intensified, becoming a deafening roar in his ears. His hand reached for the door. He had to escape, but as he touched the handle, a sickening sensation washed over him. The handle was cold, but it wasn't just cold. It felt alive, like it had a pulse, like it was made of something more than metal. It burned his skin when he touched it, and he cried out in pain, pulling his hand away. He turned around, but the figure was closer now. It was only a few feet away, and Marcus could see it more clearly now. Its face was obscured by a black hood, but its eyes glowed, an unnatural light that burned through the darkness like two burning coals. Suddenly, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice low and guttural, as though it were not entirely human. "Now you are part of it. Forever." Marcus's heart stopped. He tried to back away, but the figure reached out with a long, skeletal hand, its fingers impossibly thin and long, like claws. The air around him seemed to distort as it moved, and for a moment, Marcus could see something strange, an outline of a door, a faint glimmer of light. He thought he saw an exit. Desperation surged through him. He lunged toward the door, ignoring the pain in his body, ignoring the growl of the figure behind him. His hand brushed the door again, and this time, he didn't hesitate. He gripped the handle tightly, pushing it open. But as soon as he stepped through, the world seemed to shift. The door slammed shut behind him, and Marcus found himself in a new room. It was even darker here, the only light coming from a flickering candle at the far end. The air smelled stale, and the walls seemed to close in on him. The room felt wrong, distorted. The furniture in the room looked out of place, some of it ancient, others far too modern. It was as though time itself had fractured in this place. The door he had just passed through vanished, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. Marcus turned to face the room, panic rising in his chest. What had just happened? How was he here? As he took a step forward, he froze. There, in the corner of the room, were shadows, shifting shadows. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But as he stared, the shadows began to take shape. They were no longer just dark patches. They were figures, Figures with faces twisted in agony. The shadows were people. People who had been trapped here, just like him. His breath hitched, and he stepped backward, his mind spinning. He wanted to run, to escape, but he knew there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in, and the figures in the shadows began to move. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their eyes, dark and hollow, told the story of their torment. "Help us," one of them whispered, its voice barely audible. Marcus's chest tightened. He didn't know if he could trust them, but he couldn't stand the thought of being trapped here forever. "How do I get out?" he asked, his voice shaking. Another figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. "You cannot leave until the curse is broken." "The curse?" Marcus asked, his mind racing. "What curse?" But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it pointed toward the center of the room, where a large stone altar stood. The altar was ancient, its surface covered in bloodstains and strange markings, and on top of the altar lay a book, thick, old, and bound in what looked like human skin. "It's in there," the figure whispered. "The answer to everything." Marcus's gaze flickered toward the book. It called to him, its presence more powerful than anything he had felt before. The air around it hummed with dark energy, and his skin tingled as he moved closer. But as he reached for it, a scream echoed through the room. The walls seemed to shake as though the very foundation of the house was being torn apart. The shadows screeched, their eyes turning bloodshot with rage. Marcus hesitated, his hand still hovering over the book. The whispers were growing louder now, urging him to take it. But he felt something else, something far darker. The book was alive. The shadows around him began to converge, their bodies writhing like serpents. Their hands reached out, their fingers long and sharp, as though they were desperate to stop him. He could feel the heat of their breath, the stench of decay, as they closed in. And then, as if the house itself was alive, the room began to warp. The walls twisted, the floor buckled beneath him, and Marcus felt himself being pulled in all directions. The darkness pressed in from every side, and he could hear the figures screaming, the sound of them pleading. "You cannot escape," one of them howled. "The house owns you now." But Marcus was too far gone. He reached for the book, pulling it from its place with all his strength, and everything went silent. Marcus's hand trembled as he held the book, feeling its unnatural weight in his palms. The moment it left the altar, the room seemed to react, shuddering with an inhuman force. The flickering candlelight went out in an instant, and the shadows that had been creeping along the walls now surged forward, encircling him. Their whispering voices grew louder, a cacophony of despair and rage that clawed at his mind, pulling at the edges of his sanity. "Put it back," a voice hissed, a distorted, choking sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as the air thickened around him. The walls were bending, narrowing toward him, as though the very space itself was closing in, drawing him into some dark, infinite abyss. His skin prickled with an electric charge that made every nerve scream in panic. The book, heavy with some ancient evil, pulsed in his hands, as though it were alive, responding to the unseen forces around him. Its pages fluttered as if caught in an invisible breeze, but the whispering voices became clearer, more distinct. Each word sounded like a command, a curse, an ancient chant that Marcus couldn't understand, yet felt deep within his bones. "Don't open it," the voice from the shadows warned, growing louder and more frantic. "It is not meant for your hands." He had no choice. His fingers itched to open the book. The whispers were too compelling, too persistent. His instincts screamed at him to run, but the weight of the book was dragging him down, making him feel as if the house itself was anchoring him to this cursed place. Unable to resist any longer, Marcus slowly opened the book, his heart racing in his chest. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, and written in a language that felt ancient, alien. Symbols danced across the pages, shifting and moving as though they were alive. They seemed to shift, reorganizing themselves, drawing Marcus's eyes deeper into the text. The room began to warp again. The shadows that had surrounded him now swirled violently, their figures twisting and contorting into grotesque forms. The air grew colder, sharper, as though the very atmosphere was being sucked out of the room. The walls began to crack, dark veins of blackness spreading like webs, creating a network of darkness that seemed to pulse with an energy that was malevolent and all-consuming. A sudden pressure built in Marcus's chest. It felt as if something was pushing in from every direction, squeezing his heart. He gasped, but his breath came in shallow, painful bursts. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. His eyes darted across the pages of the book, searching for some explanation, some way to reverse whatever had been set in motion. The figure in the shadows, the one that had been guiding him, or perhaps hunting him, emerged from the darkness, stepping toward him with slow, deliberate movements. The figure's form was now clearer, its long, skeletal fingers reaching out, its face still obscured by a hood that seemed to be made of pure shadow. But as it drew closer, Marcus could see its eyes, eyes that glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, eyes that were filled with a hunger so deep and consuming that it made his stomach churn. "You should never have opened it," the figure intoned in a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, each one more ancient and bitter than the last. "Now you've awakened it. The curse is upon you." Marcus tried to back away, but his legs refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, unable to escape the suffocating presence of the figure and the oppressive darkness that had consumed the room. The air around him crackled with energy, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The book, still open in his hands, began to glow, its pages flashing with a bright, sickly light. The symbols on the pages pulsed and shifted, and Marcus could feel them pulling at his mind, pushing against his thoughts, trying to invade his very consciousness. He wanted to throw the book away, but the words inside it, those maddening, incomprehensible words, were crawling into his mind, settling into his thoughts, worming their way into his soul. The house groaned, as though it were alive, its walls vibrating with the power of the curse that had been unleashed. The figure stepped closer, and Marcus could feel the cold emanating from it, freezing him in place. He was suffocating under its gaze. It was as if the figure could see into the deepest recesses of his mind, understanding his every fear, every weakness, and it was feeding on that fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. "Do you understand now?" the figure hissed. "Do you understand what you have unleashed?" Marcus's head swam. The world around him spun, distorting into a nightmarish blur of shapes and colors. The book in his hands felt heavier, as though it were dragging him deeper into the very bowels of the house, into the heart of the curse. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his vision began to narrow, the edges of his sight fading into blackness. In the distance, he thought he saw movement, a shape, a figure standing in the shadows beyond the figure before him. It was familiar, though distorted, twisted by time and by the same dark energy that had consumed everything else. A woman's face appeared in the shadows, her eyes hollow and empty, her skin pale as if drained of life. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The woman's gaze was fixed on him, full of sorrow and warning. "Leave before it's too late," she whispered, her voice faint and ethereal. But it was too late. The figure in front of him let out a horrible, guttural laugh. The sound was so loud and so raw that it felt like a physical blow to Marcus's body. The room cracked open like a wound, and from within the dark void, Marcus could feel the pressure of something ancient and terrible pushing its way through, as though it had been waiting for this moment to finally break free. "You will never leave," the figure sneered. "The house will consume you, just as it has consumed all those before you. You're a part of it now, forever." The darkness closed in on Marcus, and his mind, already teetering on the edge of madness, shattered under the weight of the curse. The book, still glowing, seemed to pulse with a malevolent rhythm, a heartbeat that was not his own. And then, in the final moments before everything collapsed into darkness, Marcus understood. The house was alive. It had always been alive, and it had always been waiting for someone to open the book, waiting for someone to bring it into this world. As the world around him crumbled into nothingness, he heard the whispers one last time. "Welcome to the house. Welcome to eternity." As the darkness pressed in on Marcus, suffocating him with its heavy, malevolent weight, he felt his body grow numb. Every breath he took was like inhaling a thick, poisoned fog, the air heavy with the acrid scent of decay. The house seemed to exhale with him, its walls groaning in some unfathomable rhythm, like a living, sentient being with a heart that beat in time with his own fading pulse. The book in his hands pulsed again, its sickly glow flashing once more, each beat an excruciating reminder that he had unleashed something far beyond his understanding. The pages of the book fluttered on their own, as though they were eager to reveal more. But Marcus couldn't tear his eyes away. He was drawn to the text, his fingers unwillingly tracing the symbols, feeling an insistent pull in his mind. The shadows around him danced, their forms elongating, distorting into twisted versions of themselves, like grotesque parodies of human shapes. Some of them had faces now, distorted, anguished faces that screamed silently, their mouths stretched wide in eternal agony. Others had no faces at all, just voids that seemed to swallow the light. They circled him, getting closer, pressing against him, whispering their maddening chants in a language he couldn't comprehend, but could feel in his very soul. "Run," one of the shadows whispered, its voice cold and distant, like the wind passing through a graveyard. "Run before it's too late." Marcus couldn't respond. His throat was dry, his body too weak to react. But his mind was alive with terror. Something had changed in the house. It wasn't just the walls that were alive. It was the entire structure, the very foundation, its heart pulsing with an energy he couldn't fathom. It wasn't just a house. It was something older, something that had been waiting, watching, and it had found him. "Leave." The voice from the shadows sounded distant, yet insistent, as if it were echoing from another time, another place. "You can't outrun it. It's coming." Suddenly, Marcus felt a sharp pain in his chest. His heart seemed to stutter, the rhythm of its beat distorted, as though something had clamped around it, squeezing with a vice-like grip. He gasped for air, but it didn't come. The pressure intensified, squeezing the very life out of him. His vision blurred, the edges darkening, and the voices in the shadows grew louder, more frantic, more desperate. In the center of the room, the figure, the one with the glowing eyes, loomed. Its presence radiated an unholy energy, an energy that seemed to warp the air itself, distorting reality. It stepped forward, its movement slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "You cannot escape," the figure growled, its voice a low rasp that sounded like it had been carved from centuries of suffering. "You're bound to this place now, just like the others." Marcus stumbled backward, his legs trembling beneath him. He was weak, every movement a struggle, but he managed to back into one of the walls. The room itself seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing forward, the ceiling lowering, the floor shifting beneath him, as if the entire house was alive and responding to the darkness that had been awakened. He turned toward the door, hoping for an escape, but it was gone. The doorway that had once led out of the room had vanished, replaced by a wall of impenetrable blackness. Panic surged through him, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps as the shadows closed in around him. "Why did you open it?" the figure asked, its tone almost mournful, but beneath the sorrow, there was a coldness, a bitterness that was unmistakable. "Why did you awaken the curse?" Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat was dry, his mouth a desert. His mind was a jumble of terror and confusion. The book, the cursed book, was still in his hands. It had to be the key. It was the only thing that had made sense in this nightmare. He needed to find a way to close it, to stop whatever had been unleashed. But every time he tried to focus, the words on the page seemed to dance, shifting into shapes that made his head spin. They were like eyes, staring at him, judging him. Suddenly, the darkness intensified. The shadows reached out like tendrils, grabbing at him, pulling him deeper into their suffocating embrace. He felt cold hands around his wrists, dragging him away from the wall, lifting him off the ground. His body flailed in panic, but the shadows were too strong, their grip unyielding. "Do you know what you've done?" The figure was right in front of him now, its glowing eyes boring into his. You've opened the door that should have remained sealed. Marcus struggled, his mind racing. What door? What had he unleashed? Was it too late to stop it? His heart pounded as the shadows closed in tighter, pulling him toward the center of the room, toward the altar. No, he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. I don't understand. The figure's face twisted into something darker, more grotesque. You will, soon enough. With a sudden lurch, Marcus was thrown to the ground. His head slammed against the cold stone floor, and the world went black. When Marcus opened his eyes again, the world had changed. The room was no longer the familiar chamber it had been. The walls were now covered in a thick, creeping moss. The floor slick with some kind of dark, sticky substance. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the light, if it could even be called light, was faint and sickly, casting long, distorted shadows that twisted and stretched across the room like living things. He sat up, groaning, his head throbbing. His body felt heavy, as though something was pressing down on him from all sides. His breath came in short, shallow bursts as panic surged once more. He looked around, disoriented, only to find that he was no longer alone. The figure was standing in front of him, its eyes glowing brighter now, its face more distinct, its features twisted in a way that defied all reason. I told you, the figure whispered, its voice a strange mix of pity and menace. You've crossed the threshold. There's no going back now. Marcus tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey. He felt as though the very earth beneath him had turned to quicksand, dragging him deeper into its suffocating grip. What is this place? He managed to croak, his voice ragged with fear. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it stepped aside, allowing Marcus to see the full extent of the room. And what he saw made his blood run cold. The room was no longer a room at all. It was a vast, cavernous space, stretching impossibly far, its walls lined with twisted, gnarled roots that seemed to pulse with some malevolent energy. The air was thick with an oppressive, unrelenting pressure, as though the very atmosphere was alive, suffocating, choking. And from the shadows, Marcus could see shapes moving, things that shouldn't exist. Faces, eyes, hands, shadows of people long gone, their bodies trapped in the web of darkness that had overtaken the house. Where am I? Marcus whispered, his voice breaking as terror overtook him. The figure smiled, its teeth sharp and unnaturally white. You're in the heart of the house, it said. This is where the curse was born. This is where it feeds. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath him, and a deep, guttural growl reverberated through the walls. The shadows seemed to shift, becoming more erratic, more aggressive. A low, terrifying growl filled the room, as if something was waking from a long slumber, something ancient, something hungry. And Marcus realized, in that moment, that the worst part of all wasn't the house, or the curse, or the figure before him. The worst part was that he had awakened something far more terrifying. It was already too late. Marcus's mind was a blur, his thoughts fractured like the walls around him. The figure before him, no longer human, or anything he could truly understand, stepped back, its presence darkening the already grim atmosphere. The shadows of the room seemed to coil tighter, crawling over every surface, seeping into the air itself like a living fog. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, each pulse a violent reminder that he was still alive, still caught in the grip of something that was slowly and inevitably consuming him. His head swam with confusion and dread, but a strange, desperate clarity cut through. He needed to escape. He needed to break free from this nightmare. The walls around him seemed to stretch, the space widening unnaturally, as though the house itself was growing. The sound of a distant, slow scraping filled the room, growing louder with each passing moment, like something dragging itself along the floor. The shadows shifted in time with the sound, and Marcus could hear whispers. But as the scraping drew closer, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, almost pleading. "Leave, leave, leave," they hissed. Marcus turned toward the figure, his voice a hoarse whisper. What is this? What is happening to me?" The figure's hollow eyes burned with cold malice. Its mouth didn't move, but the words emerged from it anyway. echoing in Marcus's mind as if the figure were speaking directly to his soul. "You opened the door, Marcus. Now you must pay the price. You must become one with us." A sickening chill ran down Marcus's spine as he struggled to stand, his legs like jelly beneath him. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, his vision swimming with the dark mist that seemed to close in on him. A low growl rumbled through the ground, vibrating the very air. It was a sound that seemed to come from the house itself, an ancient, unholy growl that reverberated through Marcus's bones. The room trembled, the walls cracking as if they, too, were alive, reacting to the beast that was awakening beneath them. "Do you hear it?" the figure asked, its voice sharp and piercing. "The hunger, it wakes with every breath you take. It's in the house. It's in you now." Marcus's mind raced. He was barely able to process what the figure was saying. All he could focus on was the growl, the vibrations beneath his feet, the way the shadows seemed to move with a malevolent purpose, closing in on him from every direction. His skin crawled, his body numb, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled him. The book, the cursed book, still lay in his trembling hands. He had no idea what to do with it. It had brought him here, to this nightmare, and now it felt like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to some semblance of reality. Without thinking, he opened the book again, hoping for some kind of answer, some way out. The pages flipped on their own, faster than he could track, the symbols on the page flashing and shifting before his eyes. His vision blurred as the words twisted into shapes that no human mind should ever comprehend. "No!" Marcus screamed, slamming the book shut with a force that rattled his teeth. But it was too late. The ground shook violently beneath him, knocking him off balance. The walls of the room collapsed inward, disintegrating into dust and debris, revealing an enormous, cavernous space that stretched endlessly in every direction. The darkness seemed to devour the room, leaving only the dim, flickering glow of the book's pages as a faint source of light. Marcus scrambled to his feet, his legs unsteady, as he tried to make sense of the nightmarish scene unfolding before him. A monstrous figure emerged from the depths of the darkness. It was like nothing he had ever seen, part human, part something far worse. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over its skeletal frame. Its eyes were wide, too large for its face, and black as the void. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, a jagged maw filled with rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. The growling sound intensified as it moved toward him, its claws scraping against the stone floor in a maddening rhythm. Marcus froze. His body refused to obey his commands. His breath caught in his throat as the creature advanced, its grotesque form shuddering with anticipation. The book slipped from his grasp, falling to the floor with a soft thud. "You shouldn't have read it, Marcus," the creature whispered in a voice that was more a thought than sound, its presence pressing against his mind. "Now the door is open, and the curse is unleashed." The room, or whatever this place had become, seemed to close in on him. The shadows thickened, taking on tangible form, stretching toward him like hundreds of grasping hands. The growl of the beast reverberated in his chest, drowning out everything else as the darkness overwhelmed him. Then everything stopped. For a moment there was no sound, no movement, no growl, no shadows, just an oppressive, suffocating silence that felt as though it were choking the very life from the room. Marcus's heart raced as he slowly turned to look around, unsure of what had just happened. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. And then he heard it, a faint whisper, "Behind you." Before he could react, the shadows closed in on him, and the air around him seemed to crackle with a dark energy. The ground beneath him trembled again, more violently this time, and a deafening roar filled his ears. He spun around, his pulse hammering in his chest, but all he could see was darkness, a void that seemed to pull him in, swallowing him whole. The figure appeared again, emerging from the inky blackness. It was larger now, towering over him, its eyes glowing brighter, its body swelling as if it were growing from the very darkness itself. "You're mine now," the figure crooned. "The curse has chosen you, and it will never let you go." Marcus opened his mouth to scream, but no sound emerged. It was as though the air had thickened to a point where even his voice was crushed. The figure's monstrous form loomed over him, and he could feel its icy breath on his skin. He was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to think. The shadows were closing in, tightening their grip, pulling him deeper into the void that had taken over the room. The book, the cursed book, was still on the floor, just out of his reach, but its faint glow had dimmed. He couldn't focus on it anymore. He couldn't focus on anything except the darkness that seemed to be consuming him. The figure was right. It was too late. There was no escape from this hell. He had unleashed something ancient, something hungry, and now it was time to pay the price. Marcus's vision blurred, his mind fading as the darkness closed in around him, suffocating him, dragging him into the depths of whatever hell had been waiting. His last thought, as the shadows enveloped him completely, was that he had made a terrible mistake, a mistake that he could never undo. The house had won. The darkness closed in around Marcus like an overwhelming wave, suffocating him, dragging him further into its embrace. He felt the air grow colder, as if the very atmosphere had turned against him, pressing down on his chest, each breath a laborious effort. The figure, its eyes burning with an otherworldly light, loomed above him like some monstrous god, its presence filling the room, warping reality around him. Marcus couldn't move. His limbs were heavy, unresponsive, his body paralyzed by a fear so intense it seemed to claw at his insides, eating away at him from the inside out. His mind raced with questions. How had this happened? What was this place? What had he awakened? The shadows that filled the room were no longer just a passive backdrop to his nightmare. They were alive, writhing like snakes, each tendril reaching toward him, dragging their cold, clammy fingers across his skin. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His throat was dry, constricted, as though something was blocking his voice, choking him from the inside. The figure before him seemed to pulse with energy, its form flickering, shifting like smoke, its monstrous shape distorting and reforming in ways that defied logic. Its voice, when it came, was a low, guttural whisper that vibrated deep within Marcus's skull. Do you see it now? The figure's words echoed in Marcus's mind, a twisted reflection of his thoughts. You opened the door, Marcus. You invited it in. Now you must pay. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last, until it drowned out everything else. His vision began to swim, the edges of the room blurring as his mind struggled to process the horror unfolding around him. His thoughts were a whirlwind of terror, memories of the book, of the whispers, of the strange occurrences in the house. Had he been led here on purpose? Was this some kind of twisted fate, or was it his own foolishness that had caused this? The truth was slipping through his fingers, and all he could focus on was the figure, the darkness, and the growing sense of doom that pressed against him like a tangible force. The shadows around him seemed to pulse in time with the beating of his heart, growing thicker, more oppressive. The air was thick with an almost metallic scent, like rust and decay. The figure reached out toward him, its hands stretching, impossibly long, fingers curling like talons. Marcus flinched, trying to pull away, but there was nowhere to go. The room had vanished, replaced by an endless, pitch-black abyss, and he was trapped in the center of it. Suddenly, the figure lunged. Marcus barely had time to react. Its claws closed around his throat, cold and unyielding, cutting off his air supply. His vision swam, and his heart seemed to stop as the creature's eyes locked onto his. There was something in those eyes, something ancient, hungry, predatory. It was as if the very essence of the thing had been waiting for him, watching him, for as long as he could remember. This was not a random encounter. This was not just bad luck. This was a reckoning. You shouldn't have read it. The figure hissed, its voice low and sinister. Now you will understand the cost. You will understand the price of ignorance. The pressure on Marcus's throat increased, and for a moment, his mind went blank. He could feel himself slipping into unconsciousness, the world around him growing darker, colder. But then, a flicker of light, faint and distant, pierced the darkness. It was a memory, a distant thought. The book. His hands, shaking violently, fumbled for the cursed book that had caused all of this. It had fallen to the floor earlier, forgotten in the chaos. With what little strength he had left, Marcus reached out and grabbed it, the pages now glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. The moment his fingers made contact with the book, the figure recoiled, a shriek of pain filling the air as though it had been struck by a force it could not understand. The shadows twisted violently, pulling away from him, recoiling in terror. The air seemed to hum with energy, and the book, still clutched in his hands, pulsed with a dark, vibrating power. The figure howled in rage, but it no longer seemed to have the same control over Marcus. Desperation surged through Marcus's body, and with all his remaining strength, he slammed the book open again. The pages flicked wildly, but this time, they didn't form into the same indecipherable symbols. They were different now. The pages were filled with strange, cryptic words, words that seemed to make sense, that seemed to reach out to him, like an echo from a past long forgotten. The figure shrieked again, its form flickering in and out of existence, as if it were being torn apart by some unseen force. Marcus's mind raced, trying to comprehend the words on the page, trying to understand what was happening, what he had done. The room, the darkness, the monster, it was all tied to this book. Somehow, the book was the key. But just as he thought he might be able to do something, to fight back, the ground beneath him gave way. With a sickening lurch, he was pulled forward, falling into the abyss. The figure screamed in fury as the book was ripped from his hands, disappearing into the black void. The world around him twisted, breaking apart like fragile glass, fragments of light and sound shattering into a cacophony of chaos. He was falling endlessly into a dark, endless void. And then everything went silent. When Marcus opened his eyes, he was no longer in the same place. The house was gone. The monster was gone. The darkness was gone. He was standing in a familiar place, the old forest near his childhood home. The trees loomed overhead, casting long, twisted shadows across the forest floor. But there was something wrong with this place. It was too quiet. The air was heavy with an unnatural stillness, as if the very earth held its breath. Marcus stumbled forward, his body weak and exhausted from the terror he had endured. He wasn't sure how he had ended up here. He remembered falling, but it was like his mind had been reset. He couldn't remember how long he had been gone, or if the things he had experienced were real at all. But then, the whispers began again. Low at first, soft and distant, like a gentle breeze. But then they grew louder, more insistent. Marcus! Marcus! The voice called his name. Familiar, and yet not. It was the same voice he had heard before. The one that had tormented him in the house. It had found him again. Panic surged through him as he turned in every direction. But the forest was empty. No sign of life. No sign of escape. The whispers grew louder. You can't run from us, Marcus. You can't escape. He closed his eyes, shaking his head, trying to block out the voice, trying to make it stop. But it was no use. The darkness was still with him. It had followed him here. And the book was still out there, waiting, calling. Marcus had thought he had escaped, but the truth was worse than he could have imagined. The curse was not something that could be outrun. It was something that followed, something that waited patiently in the shadows, ready to claim him once again. Marcus stood motionless in the eerie silence of the forest, the unsettling whispers still swirling around him, growing louder and more persistent with each passing second. It was as if the trees themselves were whispering his name, urging him to return to the nightmare he had barely escaped. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and despite the stillness, a sense of movement seemed to press in on him from all directions. It was as though the forest was alive, watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. He tried to move, to take a step away from the ominous trees, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. His heart pounded in his chest, and a cold sweat slicked his skin. His mind raced with the memories of what had happened, of the cursed book, the monstrous figure, and the endless abyss. Had he really escaped? Was this some twisted trick of the darkness, pulling him back into its grasp? Marcus! The whisper came again, Clearer this time, more distinct. It was a voice that felt familiar, yet distant, as if it belonged to someone he once knew, but could no longer remember. He whipped around, but the forest remained as it had been, silent, dark, and foreboding. There was no one there. No one except for the trees, the shadows, and the growing sense of dread that seemed to suffocate him from all sides. The ground beneath his feet shifted slightly, as though the earth itself was alive, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. It felt wrong, unnerving, as if the world around him was warping, bending in ways that defied reality. He could feel his pulse quickening as the whispers continued to call to him, growing louder and more insistent. The words were no longer just whispers. They were commands, demands. His name echoed in the air like a chant, pulling him forward against his will. "Come back, Marcus. Come back to us." The voice was unmistakable now. It was the same voice he had heard in the house, the voice of the creature that had haunted him, that had dragged him through the darkest corners of his mind. He was no longer just hearing it. He was feeling it, sensing it deep within his bones, as if the very essence of the creature had seeped into the fabric of his being. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath him, and a low, guttural growl reverberated through the air. He looked up in time to see a shape emerging from the darkness between the trees, a figure cloaked in shadow, its features obscured by the thick fog that had begun to roll in. It was tall, taller than any human being had a right to be. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural, red light, and its form seemed to shift and flicker as if it were a creature made of smoke and nightmares. Marcus's breath caught in his throat, and his body tensed. He tried to move, but his legs refused to obey. The creature was closer now, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it were savoring every moment of fear that radiated off of him. "Did you think you could escape, Marcus?" The creature's voice was a low, menacing hiss, and it seemed to vibrate through the very air around him. "There is no escape. You belong to us now." Marcus's mind raced, the terror threatening to consume him as he tried to process what was happening. The book, the curse, everything had been leading him here. This creature, whatever it was not just part of his nightmare. It was a part of something much darker, something much older. The creature stepped forward, its long, bony fingers reaching out toward him. The air around him grew colder, and the ground beneath him seemed to give way, as though the earth itself was ready to swallow him whole. His breath came in short, panic gasps, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out from the sheer weight of his fear. But then, something inside of him snapped. The memory of the book, of the words that had almost set him free, flashed in his mind. The book. He had to find it. He had to finish what he had started. Without thinking, he bolted forward, his feet finally obeying him, propelling him through the forest at a frantic pace. The creature's growl echoed behind him, but Marcus didn't dare look back. The path ahead was twisted and treacherous, the trees closing in on him like the jaws of a beast. But he had no choice but to keep moving. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their voices now blending into a chorus of maddening noise. But through the chaos, Marcus could hear one voice, familiar, comforting. "Don't stop. Keep moving." It was the voice of his mother, the voice that had always calmed him in his darkest moments. It was a memory, a fleeting echo from his childhood, but it gave him the strength to push forward. His feet stumbled over the uneven ground, and he nearly tripped over a root. But he kept going. There was no turning back now. He had to find the book. He had to finish what he had started, or he would never be free. The fog thickened as he ran, the trees growing more twisted, their gnarled branches reaching out like fingers, trying to ensnare him. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the whispers became a cacophony of voices, all calling his name, all demanding his attention. He reached a clearing, his chest heaving as he stopped to catch his breath. The trees around him seemed to close in, their branches blocking out the sky. There, in the center of the clearing, was the book. It lay on the ground, its pages fluttering as if beckoning him. Marcus's heart raced as he approached it. The book was glowing now, its pages shimmering with an eerie light. It was as if the book itself were alive, waiting for him to return. He dropped to his knees and grabbed it, The moment his fingers touched the cover, sending a shock of energy coursing through his body, the whisper stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. A deep, suffocating silence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. But then, the ground trembled again, and the creature's voice rang out once more, louder than before. "You cannot undo what has been done, Marcus." The voice was all around him now, reverberating through the very air, vibrating his bones. He could feel the creature's presence growing stronger, closer, as if it were closing in on him, preparing to consume him whole. Marcus opened the book, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. The words on the pages were still the same, still cryptic, still impossible to understand. But there, at the back of the book, was something different. A new page, one that hadn't been there before. He leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the text. This time, the words were different, clearer, more precise. "Call forth the shadow." The words read. "Release the binding." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Was this the answer? Was this the way to break the curse? To end this nightmare once and for all? He didn't have much time. The creature was almost upon him, its shadow falling across the ground like an omen. The air was thick with its presence, and Marcus could feel the weight of it pressing in on him, suffocating him. "Call forth the shadow," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. He wasn't sure what it meant, but he knew he had to try. He had to do something. With a deep breath, Marcus closed his eyes and spoke the words aloud. "Release the binding." Marcus felt his heartbeat thundering in his chest, the ground beneath his feet vibrating as though it were alive. The whispering voices surrounded him, slithering through the air, weaving into his thoughts like invasive tendrils. The book in his hands felt heavier now, its cover slick with sweat as his fingers clenched around it. He could feel the power within the pages, a dark force that threatened to overwhelm him. The words he had just read echoed in his mind, twisting and warping like a chant that had taken root deep in his soul. "Release the binding," he whispered again, the words trembling on his lips. He wasn't sure what it meant, but he had no choice now. The creature was near, its presence suffocating, filling the air with a darkness so thick it made it hard to breathe. As he spoke the incantation aloud, a sudden silence fell over the clearing. It was as if the world itself had stopped, holding its breath. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, the shadow. It moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, creeping from the darkness between the trees. Its form was barely visible, a shifting mass of blackness that seemed to devour the very light around it. Marcus's pulse quickened, and his mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. His body felt paralyzed, caught in the grip of some unseen force. The air around him grew colder, biting at his skin like icy claws. The ground beneath him seemed to shift again, as if the earth itself were alive and trying to pull him under. Then the voice came, soft and insistent, a low growl that vibrated in his chest. "You shouldn't have done that, Marcus." He turned, his eyes wide with terror, but the creature was still hidden in the shadows. He could feel it, though, its presence, its hunger. It was as if it were circling him, drawing closer with every passing second. "You think you can break the curse? You are already ours," the voice hissed, growing louder, more insistent. "You belong to the darkness." The book in Marcus's hands began to tremble, its pages flipping rapidly, as though caught in a wind that only it could feel. The words on the pages were shifting, changing, as though they were alive. He tried to read them, but they were no longer the same. They had become a grotesque jumble of symbols and letters that seemed to writhe on the page like snakes. The creature stepped forward, its form becoming clearer now, though still shrouded in shadows. Marcus could see its eyes, red, glowing, and filled with malice. It was humanoid in shape but twisted, its limbs long and unnaturally thin, its body stretching and contorting as though it were a reflection of something that should not exist. Its mouth was a gaping void, filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to mock him with their monstrous grin. "You cannot escape us, Marcus. We are the ones who created you. We are the ones who gave you life." The word sent a chill down his spine, and his grip on the book tightened. The creature was right. It was as if his very existence had been shaped by this thing, this curse that had taken hold of him the moment he opened the book. Everything, from the nightmares to the whispers, had been leading him here, to this moment of reckoning. "You should have never read it," the creature continued, its voice a low, guttural growl. "Now you will join us. You will become one with the darkness." Marcus's mind raced. There had to be something he could do. He couldn't let this thing take him. He couldn't let it consume him. He had to find a way out. His eyes scanned the clearing desperately, searching for anything that could help. The book, maybe the answers were still inside it. Maybe he could reverse the curse, undo what he had unleashed. But the words on the pages were still shifting, changing in a maddening spiral of symbols he couldn't understand. Suddenly, the ground beneath him cracked open with a loud, deafening sound. The earth seemed to split, opening up like a mouth ready to swallow him whole. The creature stepped closer, its glowing eyes locked onto him with a predatory intensity. Marcus's heart raced as he stumbled backward, the crack in the earth widening, pulling him toward it. He reached for the book, clutching it to his chest as though it were his lifeline, the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. "Release the binding," the voice whispered again. But this time it was not the creature's voice. It was something else, something deeper, more ancient. A voice that felt like it was coming from the very earth itself, from the heart of the darkness. The book in his hands began to glow, the pages shimmering with an otherworldly light. He could feel the power radiating from it, coursing through his fingers, flooding his body. It was as though the book was alive, feeding off his fear, his desperation. "Do it," the voice urged him. "Release the binding." Marcus's breath came in ragged gasps as he realized what he had to do. He had to finish it. He had to release whatever had been trapped inside the book, whatever dark force had been waiting for this moment. With shaking hands, he opened the book to the final page. The words were clear now, the symbols arranged in a perfect, horrifying pattern. There was no going back. He had no choice. With a deep breath, Marcus spoke the words aloud, his voice trembling but firm. "I released the binding." The moment the words left his mouth, the ground shook violently. The creature let out a deafening screech, its form warping and twisting as though it were being pulled apart. The shadows around them seemed to tear open, revealing a world beyond, a world of darkness and chaos, a place where the very laws of reality no longer held. Marcus stumbled back, his legs giving way as the earth cracked open beneath him. The book flew from his hands, spinning through the air like a spinning vortex. The darkness reached out, consuming everything in its path. The creature's scream echoed in his ears as he fell, his body tumbling into the abyss. The world around him seemed to fold in on itself, the darkness swallowing him whole. As Marcus descended into the abyss, his mind felt as though it were being torn apart. The darkness seemed to crawl under his skin, slithering through his veins like 1,000 cold snakes. His body convulsed with fear, the taste of terror lingering in his throat as he fell deeper into the void. Time lost all meaning, the air around him growing thick and suffocating, as if he were trapped in some endless nightmare where every second stretched on forever. Suddenly, there was a sharp jolt, and Marcus slammed into something solid. His body hit the ground with a sickening thud, the impact rattling his bones. Pain coursed through him, but the darkness didn't relent. It was still there, hanging in the air like a living thing, swirling around him. His vision was blurry, and when he managed to blink his eyes open, he was no longer in the forest. The world around him was twisted, alien. It was as though the very fabric of reality had unraveled. The sky above was a sickly shade of red, the clouds swirling with a strange energy. The ground was cracked and jagged, stretching endlessly into a horizon that seemed to warp and distort with every passing second. There were no trees, no animals, just a barren wasteland stretching out in every direction. He tried to stand, his legs trembling beneath him. His body was still recovering from the shock of the fall, but the terror of his situation drove him forward. He couldn't afford to lose time. He had to find a way out. But the air was heavy, oppressive, and every step he took felt like wading through molasses. The book. He had to find the book. His fingers instinctively reached, for his coat pocket, but it was empty. Panic surged through him like a tidal wave. He turned in a circle, scanning the desolate landscape, but there was no sign of the book. The one thing that could save him, the one thing that had been guiding him, was gone. And then he heard it, a whisper, soft at first, like the wind carrying a message just out of reach. But it grew louder, more insistent, as if the very air itself was speaking to him. The whisper twisted and distorted, weaving through his thoughts, planting seeds of dread and confusion. Marcus! He froze, the blood in his veins turning to ice. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same one he had heard earlier, the one that had come from the shadows. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was all around him, echoing in the air, vibrating in his very bones. Marcus, you can never escape. The voice was not human, not even close. It was a guttural growl, a deep, primal sound that rattled the core of his being. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, as though the very landscape was alive, feeding off his fear. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the situation. He was trapped in a place that defied all logic, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. And the voice was getting closer. Come closer, Marcus. We're waiting for you. He turned and began to run, his legs carrying him with a frantic urgency he didn't fully understand. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, the jagged cracks in the earth opening wider with each step. The sky above churned, the red clouds swirling in a vortex of malevolent energy. It was as if the very world around him was watching, waiting for him to slip up, to make a mistake. Every shadow seemed to hide a new horror. Every flicker of movement sent his heart racing. And then he saw it, a figure, standing in the distance. At first, it appeared to be a mirage, a distortion in the air. But as he drew closer, the figure became clearer, and Marcus froze in his tracks. It was a man. No, not a man, but something that resembled one. The figure stood tall, its body draped in a tattered cloak that billowed in the unnatural wind. Its face was obscured by a hood, but even from a distance, Marcus could feel the malice radiating from it. There was something deeply wrong about the figure, something that made his skin crawl. The figure turned toward him, and Marcus could see its eyes, glowing, empty voids that stared into his soul. The gaze pierced through him, cutting into his thoughts, his very essence. "Welcome, Marcus," the figure said, its voice smooth and cold. "I have been waiting for you." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea who or what this figure was, but he knew instinctively that it wasn't a friend. It wasn't even human. It was something far older, something that had been lurking in the shadows long before he had ever stepped foot in that cursed forest. "What do you want from me?" Marcus's voice shook, but he forced himself to speak. "Why am I here?" The figure tilted its head, as if amused by the question. "You've already done it, Marcus. You've unleashed what should have remained buried." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He remembered the book, the ancient curse, the whispers in the darkness. He had opened something he had never meant to unleash. And now it was too late. The figure took a step forward, its movements fluid and unnatural, as though it were gliding across the ground. With each step, the air around it grew colder, and the shadows seemed to gather, swirling around the figure like dark tendrils. "You opened the door, Marcus. Now you must pay the price." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what kind of price he would have to pay, but he could already feel the weight of it pressing down on him. It was as though the air itself was thick with dread, the very world around him closing in, suffocating him with its dark energy. Suddenly, the ground trembled again, and Marcus looked down to see the cracks in the earth widening, pulling apart like a gaping maw. The shadows rose from the depths, swirling around him like a storm of darkness. He could feel the cold hands of the abyss reaching for him, tugging at his ankles, pulling him toward the center of the void. He fought against it, struggling to keep his footing, but it was no use. The darkness was everywhere, wrapping around him like a vice, squeezing the air from his lungs. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He could feel himself being dragged toward the center of the darkness, toward the figure that watched him with those empty, glowing eyes. "You cannot escape," the figure repeated, its voice now a low growl. "We are eternal. We are the darkness that has always existed, the shadows that haunt the edges of reality." Marcus could feel his strength fading, his body growing weaker with each passing second. He had made a terrible mistake, and now there was no going back. The darkness was closing in, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But then, just as he thought it was all over, a flash of light erupted from the book. The pages glowed with a brilliant, blinding energy, and the shadows recoiled, hissing and thrashing as if they were being burned by the light. The book, once abandoned, had returned, and in that moment Marcus knew there was still hope. With the last of his strength, he reached for the book, his fingers brushing the edges of the glowing pages. The moment he touched it, a surge of power coursed through him, filling him with warmth, strength, and clarity. The darkness screamed in fury, but Marcus held on, pulling the book closer to his chest. The figure screeched, its form flickering and distorting, as though it were being torn apart by the very light that emanated from the book. The shadows around them began to dissipate, melting away into nothingness. The sky above shifted, the red clouds parting to reveal a sliver of blue. "No!" the figure howled, its voice filled with rage and desperation. "You cannot defeat us!" But Marcus stood tall, the power of the book flowing through him like a current of raw energy. He felt its presence, its wisdom, and its fury. It was time to end this nightmare. With a single word, the light from the book exploded outward, enveloping the figure and the surrounding darkness. There was a deafening roar, a sound that shook the very earth beneath him. The shadows writhed and screamed, but it was too late. The darkness was vanishing, pulled back into the void from which it had come. Marcus stood alone in the clearing, the book still glowing in his hands, the last remnants of the nightmare fading away into the distance. He had won for now, but deep in his gut, a terrible feeling remained. The darkness had not been destroyed. It had only been pushed back, and somewhere, out there in the forgotten corners of the world, it was waiting to return. Marcus stood in the eerie silence of the abyss, his heart pounding, his breathing ragged. The book was still glowing in his hands, its light now a gentle pulse rather than a blinding flare. It seemed to hum with power, like a heartbeat, resonating deep within his chest. The oppressive air that had once threatened to crush him had lifted, but there was a lingering unease, a sense that the darkness was not truly gone, just momentarily pushed back. As the light dimmed, Marcus glanced around the clearing, expecting to see the destruction he had wrought. But instead, the landscape had changed. The twisted, nightmarish terrain had vanished, replaced by a dark, mist-covered forest. Tall trees with gnarled branches stretched high into the sky, their twisted forms like skeletal hands reaching for him. The ground was damp, covered in a thick carpet of moss that muffled his footsteps. The air smelled of decay and something far more sinister, a smell that clung to his clothes, to his skin. He looked back at the book. It was now cold to the touch, its pages no longer glowing. The power that had surged through him moments ago had faded, leaving him feeling weak, as though he had expended every ounce of energy just to hold on. The weight of what he had done, what he had unleashed, hung heavily on his mind. The darkness was still there, lurking in the corners of his thoughts, waiting for the right moment to return. But how? What had happened to the figure? To the force that had sought to claim him? Was it truly gone? Or had he merely delayed its inevitable return? He tightened his grip on the book and began walking, his steps slow and deliberate. The forest around him seemed to close in, the trees bending in unnatural ways, their shadows stretching and warping as if they were alive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig beneath his feet sent a jolt of fear through him. It was as if the very woods were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the mist thickened, swirling around him like a living entity. His breath came out in shallow gasps as he fought the rising panic in his chest. There was something here, something ancient, something dark, that he could not see but could feel with every fiber of his being. He had walked into the heart of something far older and more malevolent than he could ever have imagined. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat, but unmistakable. It was the same voice he had heard before, the voice that had come from the shadows, the voice that had promised him there was no escape. Marcus! The name was a hiss, a serpent's whisper that curled through the air, winding its way into his thoughts. His spine stiffened, his body frozen in place. The voice was closer now, too close. He could feel it inside him, inside his very mind, crawling through his consciousness like a disease. You're not free. You never will be. The words rang in his ears, and Marcus's eyes darted around the misty forest, searching for the source of the voice. He saw nothing, but he felt it, felt the oppressive weight of something moving in the darkness, something watching, something waiting. He took a step backward, his heart racing. The book, his only hope, was still in his hands, but it felt strangely heavy now, as though it, too, was a burden. He needed answers. He needed to know what was happening, to understand the forces he was up against. The whispering was relentless, a constant presence in the back of his mind, like the scratching of claws against a door. Why? He shouted into the darkness. What do you want from me? The mist seemed to swirl around him, thickening with every word, as if the very air itself was responding to his call. The trees loomed closer, their twisted branches groaning under the weight of some unseen force. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the voice returned, louder this time, its tone dripping with malice. You opened the door, Marcus. You invited us in. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and Marcus's knees buckled slightly, his legs threatening to give way. He felt the temperature drop sharply, the chill seeping into his bones like a slow poison. His breath came out in visible puffs, and he realized, with growing dread, that the mist around him was no longer just fog. It was alive, a physical manifestation of the darkness that had been waiting. The door is still open, the voice said, its tone now almost amused. And so are we. The air grew heavier, thick with a palpable sense of menace. The trees seemed to pulse with life, their gnarled roots creaking and groaning as if they were coming to life. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, surrounding him like an impenetrable wall of sound. He could feel the weight of countless eyes upon him, eyes that were hidden, but whose presence was undeniable. Marcus's pulse raced, panic rising in his throat. He had to get out of here. He had to find a way to close the door, to end this nightmare once and for all. But the forest seemed to close in around him, trapping him in a maze of shadows and whispers. Suddenly, the mist parted just slightly, revealing something in the distance. A figure, standing motionless in the clearing. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, its features obscured, but there was no mistaking it. The figure was watching him. Its eyes gleamed like two burning embers in the darkness, and in that moment Marcus knew. This was the thing he had unleashed. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. As it did, the mist seemed to part even more, revealing its full form. It was humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its body too thin, and its face was a nightmare of twisted features, as if it were a mask of flesh stretched too tight. The eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth opened in a silent scream. "Do you see?" the voice asked, the words now emanating from the figure itself, its lips never moving. "Do you understand now, Marcus? You are not free. You never will be." Marcus took a step back, fear clawing at his chest. The figure raised one hand, its fingers elongating and twisting, as if they were made of shadows. The air around him seemed to ripple, and the ground beneath him trembled once more. "You will never escape," the figure hissed, its voice a low growl. "You are ours, forever." With a sudden, horrific lurch, the figure lunged toward him, its fingers stretching toward his throat. In that instant, Marcus knew there was no way out. The door had been opened, and now there was no closing it. But just as the figure's fingers were about to make contact with his skin, a blinding flash of light erupted from the book in his hands. The darkness recoiled, and the figure let out a horrific screech, its body writhing as if it were being burned by the light. Marcus felt the surge of power in his hands, the energy pulsing through him like an electric current. He couldn't explain it, but he knew this was the only thing that could save him. He focused every ounce of his will into the book, and the light flared brighter, pushing the figure back, its form distorting, unraveling like a nightmare, fading into the dawn. "You cannot defeat us," the voice hissed, its tone now full of rage. "We are eternal. We are the darkness." But Marcus didn't stop. He pressed forward, the book glowing brighter and brighter until it consumed the entire clearing in a flash of pure white light. And then there was silence. The silence was overwhelming. It pressed against Marcus like a tangible force, suffocating him with its weight. His body felt frozen, still vibrating from the intense energy that had surged through him moments ago. The light from the book had burned bright, too bright, until it had consumed everything around him, swallowing the nightmare and leaving nothing but an empty, eerie void. He could still feel the coldness of that void, an unnatural chill that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry, his limbs stiff. He felt like he hadn't moved in hours, or maybe days. It was hard to tell. The forest around him was gone. The twisted trees, the gnarled roots, the suffocating mist, they were all gone. In their place was an endless stretch of nothing, a void so black it seemed to swallow all light, leaving him alone in the dark. The book still pulsed weakly in his hands, its once violent glow now a dim, fading ember. He wanted to believe that everything had ended, that the darkness had finally been defeated. But deep down, he knew better. This was just the calm before the storm. It always was. "Marcus," the whisper came again, low and guttural, barely audible over the thumping of his own heartbeat. It was a voice he recognized, the same voice that had haunted him since the moment he had opened the cursed book. He knew it was not just a figment of his imagination, not a trick his mind was playing on him. The voice was real, and it was closer than ever before. His breath hitched in his chest as he spun around, but there was nothing, just darkness, deep, suffocating darkness. No trees, no sky, just the endless, oppressive void stretching in every direction. The silence was deafening, yet the whisper had come from within it, and he knew that whatever it was not far. "Marcus!" It was louder now, more insistent. The voice scraped against his mind like a jagged, rusted nail. His hands clenched around the book, his knuckles turning white. But still, the darkness remained. He wanted to run, wanted to escape, but his legs wouldn't move. They were rooted in place, as if the void itself was holding him there. "Are you afraid, Marcus?" The voice was no longer a whisper. It had become a low, mocking growl, its tones dripping with malice. It slid into his thoughts like oil, greasy and slick, and he could feel it worming its way deeper, burrowing under his skin, into the very core of his being. "Did you think you could escape us? Did you think you could close the door?" Marcus's stomach twisted with nausea. The words seemed to reach into him, prying open his thoughts, exposing his deepest fears, his darkest memories. The figure he had seen before, the one with the grotesque face and the glowing eyes, it was back. Its presence, its weight, was suffocating him. It was not just one creature. It was something far more ancient, more insidious, something that had been waiting for him long before he ever opened the book. He tried to speak, but his mouth was dry, his words caught in his throat. The void around him shifted, a ripple of movement in the blackness. He took a shaky step forward, and the ground beneath him seemed to breathe, a slow, rhythmic pulse, as though the earth itself was alive. "It was never about the book, Marcus," the voice continued, now a low hiss that seemed to come from every direction at once. "The book was just a key, a way for us to find you, to bring you here." A cold sweat beaded on Marcus's forehead. The ground beneath him began to crack, thin lines of light appearing in the cracks, glowing with an otherworldly blue hue. His heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. The cracks widened, the light bleeding out like ink spilled on paper. The key opened the door. The voice said, its tone suddenly soft and almost tender, as if it were comforting him. And now you belong to us. You've always belonged to us. Marcus's mind reeled. He thought of the village, of the stories he had heard as a child, tales of ancient beings, dark forces that thrived in the shadows, creatures that could reach into the hearts of men and twist them into something unrecognizable. Was it true? Had he opened a doorway to something beyond understanding? And now, was he doomed to be its servant for all eternity? The cracks in the ground spread further, and from them emerged shapes, shadows, dark and shifting, like smoke that had taken form. The shapes were amorphous at first, but then they began to take on a more distinct shape, solidifying into twisted, monstrous figures that were only half-formed, like nightmares coming to life. Marcus stepped back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His heart thudded painfully against his chest as the figures loomed closer, their forms flickering in and out of focus, their twisted faces grotesque parodies of human features. The first figure stepped forward. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched and warped, its skin an inky black that seemed to absorb all light. Its eyes, two glowing orbs, shone with an eerie, sickly light. The figure tilted its head as it stared at him, a smile stretching across its face, a smile that was far too wide, too unnatural. "Did you think we would leave you so easily?" it hissed, its voice a rasping, broken sound, as if it were scraping against something sharp. "You opened the door, Marcus. You can never shut it." The other figures began to gather around him, their forms now fully solid, their eyes gleaming with a malevolent hunger. They circled him, their movements slow, deliberate, like predators stalking their prey. Marcus's hands tightened around the book, his knuckles white. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to fight them. He had thought the light from the book would be enough. But now, it felt like a distant memory, a fleeting moment of hope that had vanished as quickly as it had come. "You can try to fight us," the figure said, its voice now soft, almost pitying. "But you will never win. You belong to us, just as your ancestors did." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as the truth hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. The stories he had heard as a child, the myths of his people, the warnings about the things that lurked in the dark, they had all been real. The ancestors, the ones who had sealed the dark forces away, had done so at great cost. And now, Marcus had undone everything they had fought for. He had unleashed something far worse than he could have ever imagined. The figure leaned in close, its cold breath seeping into his skin. "Your soul is ours, Marcus," it whispered. "You will never leave this place. You will never see the light again." The ground beneath Marcus's feet trembled again, and the figures closed in, their twisted hands reaching for him. He felt the weight of their presence pressing against him, suffocating him, as if the very air was thickening, closing in around him. But as the first cold, skeletal hand brushed against his skin, a burst of light erupted from the book in his hands. It was not the same light as before. This one was raw, uncontrolled, a blinding flare that pushed the shadows back. The figures screamed in unison, their forms writhing as the light seared them, their eyes flashing in pain. For a moment, Marcus thought he saw something, something beyond the figures, beyond the darkness. A doorway, a crack in the void, a glimpse of something else, something that could be the answer. With every ounce of strength he had left, Marcus thrust the book forward, focusing every thought, every instinct, into the light. The void seemed to push back, but the light pressed forward, relentless, flooding the space, burning away the darkness. The figures howled in agony as they were consumed, their forms dissolving into smoke, into nothing. But even as they vanished, Marcus knew this wasn't over. The darkness, the force that had come to claim him, wasn't gone. It was just waiting, waiting for the right moment to return. It always returned, the Whispering Hollow. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with nature. Emma and her friends had rented a secluded cabin in the mountains, far from the hustle and bustle of the outside world. The air was crisp, the sky a deep blue, and the forest stretched endlessly around them. Perfect, they thought. Peaceful. A paradise. But from the moment they arrived, There was something off about the place. It wasn't anything they could put their finger on exactly, but it lingered in the air, a sense of unease, a whisper just beyond their awareness. They laughed it off at first, chalking it up to their imagination. But deep down, the cabin was old, the wooden beams creaking in the wind, the floorboards groaning with each step. The furniture was mismatched, worn from years of use. But still, there was something strangely comforting about it. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance across the walls, and outside, the wind howled through the trees like a distant cry for help. It was the first night when the strange things began to happen. At around midnight, as they were gathered around the fire, telling stories and drinking wine, a low whisper echoed through the room. It was soft at first, so faint that Emma thought she might have imagined it. But as the moments passed, it grew louder. It wasn't a human voice. It was something darker, more primal. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and her heart began to race. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her friends stopped, their eyes widening in unison. They all sat still, listening to the silence, but it didn't last long. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It was a voice, but not one they could recognize. The words were unintelligible, a guttural sound that seemed to slither through the air. "What the hell is that?" one of her friends, Kate, asked, her face pale. "It's like it's coming from inside the walls." They all exchanged uneasy glances, trying to convince themselves that it was nothing more than the wind or the house settling. But deep down they all felt it, the strange presence that hung in the air, pressing in on them. Later that night, after the fire had burned out and the cabin had fallen into an eerie silence, Emma decided to take a walk outside. The moonlight bathed the forest in an almost ethereal glow, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. She wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders, trying to shake off the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. As she walked deeper into the woods, the whispers returned, but this time they weren't coming from the cabin. They seemed to be coming from the very trees themselves, carried on the wind. Emma's pulse quickened as she looked around, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling with fear. The path through the woods was narrow, the trees closing in on either side of her, their branches swaying in the breeze. She had wandered too far. The whispers had stopped, but now there was only a deep, unnatural stillness in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Emma felt her stomach twist in knots, an overwhelming sense of dread washing over her. She turned to head back to the cabin, but the path that had once been so clear now seemed unfamiliar. The trees had shifted, their shadows twisting into unnatural shapes. The wind was no longer a soft breeze. It was a howling gust that seemed to come from all directions. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she broke into a run, the path becoming more distorted, more disorienting with every step she took. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the fear growing inside her like a living thing. The trees seemed to close in on her, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. She stumbled, falling to the ground, her palms scraping against the rough earth. She pushed herself up, panic setting in, and that's when she saw it. At the edge of the clearing, standing in the moonlight, was a figure. At first, Emma thought it was one of her friends, but as she squinted, she saw the figure was much taller, much thinner, its limbs unnaturally long. It was dressed in tattered clothes, its face hidden in the shadows, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through her. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching her, her breath caught in her throat, her legs refusing to move as the figure began to step closer. Each step it took seemed to make the ground tremble, and the whispers grew louder, surrounding her from every direction. She wanted to scream, to run, but her voice was caught in her throat. The figure reached out a long, skeletal hand toward her, and she recoiled instinctively. But it was too late. The hand brushed her cheek, cold like ice. And in that moment, everything around her seemed to go black. When Emma opened her eyes, she was back at the cabin. The fire was still burning, the room exactly as it had been when she left. Her friends were sitting on the couch, looking at her with confusion and concern. But when Emma spoke, Her voice sounded distant, almost as if it were coming from someone else. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaking. "We were about to come find you," Kate said, standing up and rushing over to Emma. "You've been gone for hours. What happened out there?" Emma looked around, her heart racing. The fear that had gripped her only moments before was still present, gnawing at the back of her mind. She couldn't explain it. She couldn't explain the figure, the whispers, the way she had felt the moment it touched her. But one thing was certain. Something had followed her back. Over the next few days, the whispers became more frequent, more insistent. Emma tried to ignore them, tried to convince herself it was just the stress of the situation, but they were always there, just beneath the surface. And the figure she had seen in the woods, it hadn't just been a figment of her imagination. She saw it again, standing at the edge of the trees, watching her through the windows at night. Each time, it grew closer. Its presence became stronger, more real. Then came the night the house began to change. Emma woke up to a low, rumbling sound, like the foundation of the cabin was shifting. The air was thick with tension, and the walls seemed to be vibrating with the energy of something ancient, something powerful. She bolted upright, her heart racing as the whispers became louder, no longer distant but close. Too close. It wasn't just the house. The very land itself seemed to be alive, groaning and shifting beneath them. Emma could feel it in her bones. The thing they had awakened in the woods was not content to stay hidden. It wanted something, and it was coming for them. The door to the bedroom creaked open, and Emma's eyes widened in terror as she saw the figure standing in the doorway, its face now visible. It was pale, sickly, its skin stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were black pits, endless voids that swallowed all light. It smiled, a twisted, inhuman grin that made her stomach churn. "You cannot leave," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You have awakened us, and now you will stay." The figure stepped forward, its long, bony fingers reaching for her, and Emma screamed. She tried to run, but the wall seemed to close in around her, trapping her in the room. The figure's hand was inches from her when the ground beneath her feet gave way. She fell. The Whispering Hollow Part 2. The ground seemed to give way beneath Emma's feet with a suddenness that took her breath away. One moment, she was standing in the room, paralyzed by terror as the figure loomed closer. The next, she was falling into darkness. Her body collided with the ground, a sharp pain shooting through her limbs. But it was the cold that hit her first. It wasn't the kind of cold she had felt before. It wasn't the crisp chill of the mountain air or the biting frost of winter. No, this cold felt unnatural. The air seemed to freeze around her, seeping into her skin, into her bones, and even deeper into her soul. She struggled to sit up, her hands pressed against the ground, only to realize that the earth beneath her wasn't dirt. It wasn't even solid. It was as if she had fallen into something that felt alive. She could feel the pulse of the earth beneath her, a rhythm too slow, too heavy, almost like a heartbeat. It throbbed in her chest, sending waves of unease through her body. Her heart hammered in her chest, panic rising, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. She needed to focus. The last thing she remembered was the figure standing in the doorway of her cabin, grinning at her with its hollow eyes, telling her she could never leave. She needed to escape. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady, as if they had never supported her weight before. She glanced around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The darkness stretched out endlessly in all directions, but there was something faintly glowing in the distance. A pale, sickly light flickered in the gloom, beckoning her forward. She hesitated, but then took a step, and then another. The eerie silence around her was broken only by the rhythmic pulsing from the earth beneath her feet. Each step she took seemed to draw her closer to that glowing light, like a moth to a flame. But the more she walked, the more she could feel it. Something was wrong. Something was watching her. A shadow flitted at the corner of her vision, just out of reach. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. The light grew brighter, but it was cold, and as she moved toward it, the shadows in the periphery deepened. They were closing in on her, Her breath became shallow. She tried to run, but her feet felt heavy, weighed down by an invisible force. It was like the ground itself was trying to keep her in place, to trap her in this void of terror. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't go back. The whispers, once distant, now came rushing toward her in a torrent of jagged voices. They were everywhere all around her, calling her name. No, not her name. Something else. They spoke in languages she couldn't understand, their words like nails scratching against her mind, dragging her deeper into madness. "Come closer," one of the whispers said, the voice distorted and harsh, as if it was spoken through 1,000 mouths. Emma's body trembled, but she couldn't stop herself. Her feet moved forward, one step after another, drawn to the light. The air grew colder with each passing moment, and the whispers began to twist into laughter. The sound of it sent a shiver down her spine. She reached the light, but what she saw wasn't what she expected. The glow illuminated a large stone archway, ancient, weathered, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The archway stood in the middle of a vast, empty space, a void that stretched out forever. But beyond the arch, Emma could feel something different, something familiar. It was the sense of being watched, of being observed from all angles. She stepped closer to the arch, her heart pounding in her chest. It was then that she saw it. Beyond the archway, in the depths of the shadows, were figures. Tall, gaunt shapes, like specters in the dark. They stood motionless, their faces hidden in the shadows, their bodies twisted and malformed. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of voices now echoing in her ears. They were begging her to come closer, to step through the arch. But deep down, Emma knew that doing so would be the end of her. She tried to pull away, but her feet were rooted to the ground. The stone beneath her seemed to pulse with each beat of her heart. The figures beyond the arch began to move, their skeletal limbs creaking and groaning as they took slow, deliberate steps toward her. Their faces were still hidden, but she could feel their gaze, cold, empty, and hungry. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her chest, a pressure that felt like her ribs were being crushed. She gasped, struggling to breathe, her hands instinctively clutching her heart. It was as if the very air around her was squeezing the life out of her. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice echoed in her mind, and for the first time, it wasn't a whisper. It was clear, commanding, and terrifyingly familiar. It was the same voice she had heard the night she arrived at the cabin. "You have awoken us, and now you must stay." Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground. She was barely able to keep herself from slipping into unconsciousness, her body racked with pain. The whispers around her grew louder, more urgent, as if the figures beyond the arch were closing in. But then, just as everything seemed to fade away, a scream pierced the air. It wasn't Emma's. It was Kate's. The scene shifted. Emma's head snapped up. She was no longer in the dark void, but standing in the middle of the cabin. The fire was crackling in the hearth, casting warm, flickering light on the walls. Her friends were there, staring at her, their faces wide with confusion and fear. But something was wrong. They were all frozen in place, their eyes wide, locked on something behind her. Emma spun around, her pulse quickening as her eyes met the figure once again. It was standing in the doorway, just as it had been before. But this time, it was different. Its eyes were glowing with a sickly, green light, and its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. It didn't speak, but the message was clear. "It's too late." Emma took a step back, her hands trembling as the figure slowly advanced toward her, its long, spindly limbs moving with a fluid, unnatural grace. The air around her thickened, suffocating her, and she realized with a cold jolt that the figure was not alone. There were others. They began to materialize out of the darkness, more tall, gaunt figures, emerging from the shadows, their faces hidden, but their presence undeniable. They were closing in on her, inch by inch. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices now, all speaking in unison. And then, as the first of the figures reached out toward her, Emma felt the ground beneath her feet crack and shift. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the ceiling began to distort, twisting and warping like some grotesque nightmare. "They are here," the voice echoed in her mind once again. "And you are ours." The air inside the cabin had become thick with a strange, suffocating heaviness. Emma's heart pounded against her chest, each beat reverberating in her eardrums as she took in the grotesque scene before her. The figure standing in the doorway, no longer a mere shadow, but a monstrous entity, had begun to move, its long, skeletal arms reaching out toward her. The other figures, who had once been merely distant shapes, now seemed to emerge from the dark corners of the cabin itself, as though they were born from the very walls. Their limbs twitched unnaturally, their movements jerky, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. Their faces were still hidden in shadow, but Emma could feel their gaze, cold and insatiable, crawling across her skin. The whispers had grown louder now, deafening, all-consuming. The voices were no longer just distant murmurs. They were inside her mind, scratching at her thoughts, pulling her toward madness. They whispered her name, over and over, like a chant, but it wasn't her name they were calling. It was something else, something unholy. Each syllable sent tremors through her body, her knees buckling as if the weight of the world was crashing down on her. "Emma, come to us." The voice was closer now, reverberating through the cabin like a swarm of insects. The floor creaked underfoot, a deep groan that echoed through the silence, as if the entire house were alive, aware, and watching her. Her breath quickened. The figure in the doorway moved again, its head tilting at an impossible angle, its eyes gleaming like twin pools of liquid malice. And for the first time, Emma realized that its eyes weren't just glowing. They were pulsing, like the heartbeat of something ancient and malevolent. It was alive, alive in a way that no natural being could be. Her thoughts raced. She had to get out. She had to escape this nightmare before it consumed her, before the darkness swallowed her whole. But her body refused to obey. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, each step feeling like a mile, as if something was pulling her back, keeping her trapped in this place. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling her mind, drowning out every other sound. They began to form words, phrases, taunting, mocking, and relentless. "You can't run. You can't hide. You belong to us now." Emma clenched her fists, trying to block out the voices, but it was impossible. Her mind was slipping, her thoughts fragmented, like pieces of a shattered mirror, each one reflecting a different nightmare. She tried to scream, but no sound came from her throat, only a dry rasp that made her feel more isolated, more alone. The figure in the doorway stepped forward again, its movement slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. The air seemed to warp around it, distorting the very space in the room. Emma's eyes followed its every movement, paralyzed with fear. She couldn't look away. She didn't want to look away, but it was as if the figure's gaze held her captive, drawing her in, making her feel like she was drowning in its unholy presence. Behind her, Kate's lifeless body still lay sprawled on the floor, a cruel reminder of the horrors that had already unfolded in this place. Her once bright eyes were now empty, devoid of life, staring vacantly at the ceiling. Emma wanted to look away, but she couldn't. The sight of Kate's lifeless form was like a mirror, reflecting the fate that awaited her if she couldn't escape. The cold, empty eyes seemed to mock her, telling her that there was no hope, no way out. Suddenly, a sharp sound cut through the air, a snap, like the cracking of bones. Emma's eyes snapped back to the figure in the doorway. The grotesque being had extended one of its arms, and with a sickening crunch, it bent at the elbow, its fingers curling into claws, as though it was preparing to strike. The movement was so unnatural, so wrong, that Emma's stomach churned. It wasn't just a monster, it was something worse, something beyond comprehension. The ground beneath her feet shifted again, a violent tremor running through the cabin, knocking her off balance. She staggered, her hand shooting out to grab hold of a nearby chair to steady herself. The whispers intensified, swirling around her, clawing at her mind, trying to tear her thoughts apart. "You cannot leave this place." The words felt like poison, seeping into her consciousness, wrapping themselves around her thoughts until they became the only truth she knew. Emma could feel her own resolve breaking, her will crumbling like dry earth in the wind. It was as if the cabin itself, the darkness, the creatures, it was all one single, living entity, and she was its prey. But then, just as her mind was about to fracture completely, a sound cut through the chaos, a sound that wasn't part of the whispers. It was a voice, clear and strong, coming from somewhere deep within the cabin. Emma, the voice was familiar. It was the voice of her grandmother, the one who had raised her, the one who had always told her stories about the darkness, about the things that lurked just beyond the veil. But how could this be? Her grandmother had died years ago. Emma, you must listen. The voice grew louder, more insistent, cutting through the madness. It was coming from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself, as if her grandmother's spirit had been trapped here all along, waiting for her to return, waiting to warn her. You have to find the mirror. Emma's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. The mirror. That was it. Her grandmother had always spoken of a mirror that could reflect the truth, that could show what was hidden beneath the surface. But where was it? Where could she find it? The figure in the doorway was moving closer now, its twisted limbs stretching toward her. But Emma didn't look at it. She focused on the voice, on the words that were guiding her, pulling her through the fog of fear and uncertainty. The mirror. She turned, stumbling as she ran toward the far wall of the cabin. She knew where it was now. She had seen it before, a large, ornate mirror hanging in the back of the room, covered in dust. She had never paid much attention to it before, but now it was the only thing that mattered. The closer she got to the mirror, the more the whispers faded, replaced by a strange stillness, an eerie calm that seemed to settle over her. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold glass, and for a moment, she hesitated. What would she see? Would the mirror show her something more terrifying than the monsters that were chasing her? Would it reveal the truth about this place, about what had happened to her friends? But she couldn't stop now. She had to know. With trembling hands, she wiped away the dust from the surface of the mirror, her breath catching in her throat as she saw her reflection. But it wasn't just her reflection. The figure was there, standing right behind her, its twisted face, those glowing eyes, the grin that stretched impossibly wide. It was reflected in the mirror, but it wasn't just an image. It was real. It was standing there, in the cabin with her. And then it spoke. You cannot escape. The figure's voice was a twisted mockery of human speech. Its low, guttural growl reverberated in Emma's chest, and her pulse raced in time with the sound. The room around her seemed to warp, the walls pulsing like the beat of a heart, alive, restless, and malevolent. Every inch of the cabin felt saturated with darkness, as though the very air had thickened, each breath heavier than the last. Emma's reflection in the mirror shifted slightly, her eyes wide and horrified, but it wasn't her own movements that mirrored hers anymore. The figure behind her grinned, its twisted lips curving into a grotesque smile that seemed far too wide for its face. The reflection was wrong, unnatural. It shouldn't have been there. The figure shouldn't have been there. You thought the mirror would save you. The voice was a low hiss, crawling under her skin, scratching at her thoughts. The reflection moved closer, its skeletal hand reaching out from the glass, as if it was no longer just trapped within the surface. Emma's heart stopped for a split second, her body frozen, unable to move, her breath catching in her throat. The figure's fingers extended, pressing against the glass from the other side, the jagged nails scraping, leaving behind a trail of black marks on the surface. In that moment, Emma knew she was no longer alone. The cabin, the walls, the very foundation seemed to groan under the weight of something ancient, something that had been slumbering beneath the earth for eons, waiting for a chance to rise. This was no mere haunt. It was something much worse, something that had lived through centuries, existing on the fringes of reality, hidden away in the darkness, feeding off the fear of those foolish enough to wander into its grasp. And Emma had just made the worst mistake of her life by coming here. She snapped back, her hand shooting up to the mirror, desperately attempting to pull herself away from its pull. But the glass was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt. almost as if the chill was coming from somewhere deep within the earth itself, a place where light could never reach. As she stepped back, the figure in the reflection seemed to grow larger, its form becoming more solid, more real. Its fingers flexed, pressing against the glass harder, the surface warping, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive. The air around Emma thickened, the silence now broken by the faint sound of whispers, voices rising from the cracks in the floor, from the darkness, from the very corners of her mind. They were calling her, but it wasn't her name they spoke. No, they were calling something else, something older, something hungry. You cannot run. You cannot hide. You belong to us. The words raked across her mind like claws. Every syllable felt like a thread unraveling her sanity. Emma's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her chest heaving. She had to get out. She had to escape, but her body refused to obey. It was as if the very cabin was holding her prisoner, trapping her in its twisted embrace. Behind her, the door to the cabin creaked open, though she hadn't heard anyone enter. A faint, almost imperceptible movement caught her eye. She whipped her head around, her heart racing as she saw something, someone in the doorway. But when she looked again, there was nothing there. The room was suddenly colder, the shadows darker. She could feel the temperature drop, the breath in her lungs freezing as if the very air had turned to ice. The whispering voices grew louder, swirling around her, becoming clearer, more distinct. There was no escape. There was nowhere to run. And then, with a sickening lurch, the figure in the mirror stepped forward. Its foot slid out from the glass, its limb bending at unnatural angles as it emerged into the room, like something that had been trapped within a thin layer of water, now breaking through the surface. Emma screamed, but the sound died in her throat, swallowed by the oppressive silence. She tried to scramble backward, but her hands slipped on the cold wooden floor. Her mind was in a frenzy, her heart beating a frantic, terrified rhythm. She needed to get away. She needed to. A deafening crash echoed from above. The ceiling above her splintered, the floorboards groaning under the weight of something massive, something that didn't belong in this world. The walls trembled, and the entire cabin seemed to shake with the force of 1,000 pounding footsteps. The figure from the mirror continued to move toward her, its body stretching grotesquely, distorting and bending in ways that no human form should ever be able to do. Emma couldn't tear her eyes away. The creature, it wasn't just a figure anymore. It was a being, a dark, ancient being that had been trapped for who knows how long, waiting for someone like her to open the door, waiting for her to come close enough to feed. A low, guttural sound echoed in the cabin, a growl, primal and deep, vibrating through the walls. She could feel it in her bones. And then the air shifted, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twitch, as if they were coming to life. She couldn't see them, but she could feel them, lurking, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the figure lunged, its body twisting through the air like a snake, its hand reaching for her throat. But before it could make contact, something strange happened. The cabin groaned again. A sharp, crackling sound filled the air, like glass breaking, and then the very world around her seemed to split. The walls of the cabin splintered, breaking apart like fragile paper. The room distorted, stretching and warping in ways that defied reason. The mirror behind her shattered into 1,000 shards, each fragment spinning in midair like a kaleidoscope of broken glass. And in the center of it all stood Emma, frozen, her mind spinning in circles as everything around her unraveled. The figure's grip never reached her, but something else emerged from the rift. Another form, darker and more formless than the one before. It was not of this world. It was not human. It was something older, something that existed between the spaces, a shadow between moments, a nightmare too ancient to understand. Emma's heart raced, the terror flooding her veins, the cold sweat on her brow, as she realized that she wasn't just trapped in a haunted cabin anymore. She wasn't just running from some twisted being. She was trapped in another world, a place that didn't obey the laws of reality, a place that fed on fear, a place where nothing was safe. The mirror had been the doorway, and she had stepped through it. The floor beneath her feet cracked open like an abyss, and before she could react, the darkness seemed to swallow her whole. Emma awoke in darkness. Her body felt heavy, as though she were submerged in something thick, oppressive. She blinked, but there was no light to help her see. Panic seized her chest as she tried to move, but her limbs wouldn't respond. They were sluggish, like they had been asleep for far too long. She strained against the unseen weight that held her down, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The last thing she remembered was the cabin, the rift, the mirror, and the figure that had reached out for her. She had been falling, slipping into something darker, deeper than any nightmare she had ever encountered. But now she was here, wherever this here was. The air was thick, damp, and cold, but she felt no chill on her skin. The suffocating silence pressed against her ears, blocking out any sound. No creaking, no whispers, just nothing. With every ounce of her will, Emma forced her eyes open, but there was no change. She could see nothing, only the deep, impenetrable blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. The sense of disorientation was overwhelming, and she felt as though her very mind was unraveling. A cold, clammy sweat dripped down her back as she lay there, trying to regain control. Was she still in the cabin? Was she somewhere else entirely? The thought made her stomach twist into knots. She tried to sit up, but the weight on her chest pressed down harder, and the air seemed to turn even thicker, closing in from all sides. Then, just when she thought she might suffocate from the silence, the darkness around her began to shift. It was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but gradually, the shadows began to move, slithering, undulating like a living thing. Her heart pounded louder now, thumping in her ears as she realized what was happening. The darkness wasn't just darkness. It was alive. From somewhere deep within the murk, a whisper began. Faint at first, a voice she could barely hear, but as it grew louder, it seemed to echo from every direction. It was impossible to locate its source, as if it came from all places at once. Emma, her name, a soft hiss, a voice that was both comforting and chilling at once. She wanted to scream, but her throat was dry, constricted. Her pulse raced, each beat drumming against her chest as she fought to make sense of the situation. Was this real? Was she truly in this dark void? Or was it simply another part of the nightmare? You shouldn't have come here, the voice continued. The sound seemed to come from within her own mind, wrapping around her thoughts like a vine. You are ours now. There is no escape. Her body tensed, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. It wasn't just the voice that terrified her. It was the presence behind it, the sensation of being watched. She wasn't alone. She could feel it now, the weight of eyes upon her, unseen but ever-present, suffocating her. What are you? The words left her mouth before she could stop them. The voice in the darkness chuckled a low, distorted sound that made Emma's skin crawl. We are the forgotten. The voice spoke, the words dripping with malice, seeping into the very fabric of the air. We were here long before you came, and we will remain long after you're gone. Emma tried to move, to stand, to flee, but the weight that pressed down on her chest grew heavier. It was as if the very air was solidifying, turning into a heavy, cloying fog. She couldn't breathe. Her lungs burned for air, but the darkness tightened its grip, suffocating her from all sides. You can't escape, the voice said again, its tone growing more distorted, more grotesque. Not from us. Not from what you've unleashed. The words echoed through her mind like a drumbeat, over and over, until they became a chant, a mantra. What had she unleashed? Her heart began to race faster. The fear twisted inside her, turning her insides to liquid as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The ground beneath her feet shifted suddenly, and Emma's vision spun. The thick darkness began to dissolve, replaced by a new, horrifying sight. The blackness retreated, pulling away as though something was peeling back the veil between worlds. And what lay beyond it made Emma's blood run cold. She was no longer in the cabin. She was standing in the center of an ancient, decaying city, ruins stretching as far as her eyes could see. The structures around her were twisted, their architecture defying all reason. Walls that should have been straight leaned at unnatural angles, their surfaces covered in strange, alien symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly glow. The ground was cracked, as though it had been scorched by something catastrophic, and the air was thick with the scent of decay, like an open grave. There was no sky here, only a vast, swirling blackness above her head that seemed to move, swirling in on itself, as if it were alive. Her surroundings were so alien, so distant from anything she had known, that Emma felt her sense of reality slipping away, unraveling at the edges. "This is where we live," the voice said again, now clearer, stronger. "This is the place between places, the forgotten city that once was. And now you are here, with us." A shiver ran down Emma's spine as she looked around, realizing that the city wasn't as empty as it had seemed at first. There were figures in the distance, shadows moving just beyond her line of sight. Some were humanoid, while others were not. They lurked in the darkness, their forms too twisted and strange to fully comprehend. They were watching her as she stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the figures began to move toward her. She could hear the faint scrape of their feet against the cracked earth, the slithering of something wet and unnatural, the sound of breath, hot, ragged, as though they were getting closer. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered again, now almost a hiss. "You can never leave." Suddenly, Emma felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, and a deep, guttural rumble echoed through the air. The city was alive, alive with something ancient, something powerful. The whispering became a cacophony of voices, all of them speaking at once, their words a jumbled mess that made no sense. Yet somehow, it made her stomach churn. From the darkness, a figure emerged, a towering shape, almost too tall for her to comprehend. It stepped forward slowly, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, its movements jerky, like a puppet being controlled by some unseen hand. Its face was nothing more than a featureless mask, its eyes dark pits that seemed to consume all light, and its mouth, when it opened, revealed rows upon rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It stepped forward, its massive foot landing with a sickening thud on the ground, sending a shockwave through the city. The air shifted, warping, as if the figure's mere presence was enough to distort reality itself. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the creature, unable to look away, her body frozen in place by a mix of terror and fascination. The whispers reached a crescendo, and then, all at once, they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and then the creature spoke. "Welcome to the Hollow," it said, its voice a low, rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate through her very bones. "You've come to us, and now you will never leave." The ground trembled beneath her feet again, and Emma knew this was no dream. This was no hallucination. She was trapped in a place beyond time, beyond reality, in the heart of something that had existed long before she ever set foot in the cabin. And she wasn't alone. The creature's voice reverberated through Emma's very being, sending shockwaves of terror through her body. "You've come to us, and now you will never leave." A cold, clammy sweat dripped down her back as she lay there, trying to regain control. Was she still in the cabin? Was she somewhere else entirely? The thought made her stomach twist into knots. She tried to sit up, but the weight on her chest pressed down harder, and the air seemed to turn even thicker, closing in from all sides. Then, just when she thought she might suffocate from the silence, the darkness around her began to shift. It was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but gradually, the shadows began to move, slithering, undulating like a living thing. Her heart pounded louder now, thumping in her ears as she realized what was happening. The darkness wasn't just darkness. It was alive. From somewhere deep within the murk, a whisper began. Faint at first, a voice she could barely hear, but as it grew louder, it seemed to echo from every direction. It was impossible to locate its source, as if it came from all places at once. Emma, her name, a soft hiss, a voice that was both comforting and chilling at once. She wanted to scream, but her throat was dry, constricted. Her pulse raced, each beat drumming against her chest as she fought to make sense of the situation. Was this real? Was she truly in this dark void? Or was it simply another part of the nightmare? "You shouldn't have come here," the voice continued. The sound seemed to come from within her own mind, wrapping around her thoughts like a vine. "You are ours now. There is no escape." Her body tensed, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. It wasn't just the voice that terrified her. It was the presence behind it, the sensation of being watched. She wasn't alone. She could feel it now, the weight of eyes upon her, unseen but ever-present, suffocating her. "What are you?" The words left her mouth before she could stop them. The voice in the darkness chuckled, a low, distorted sound that made Emma's skin crawl. "We are the forgotten," the voice spoke, the words dripping with malice, seeping into the very fabric of the air. "We were here long before you came, and we will remain long after you're gone." Emma tried to move, to stand, to flee, but the weight that pressed down on her chest grew heavier. It was as if the very air was solidifying, turning into a heavy, cloying fog. She couldn't breathe. Her lungs burned for air, but the darkness tightened its grip, suffocating her from all sides. "You can't escape," the voice said again, its tone growing more distorted, more grotesque. "Not from us. Not from what you've unleashed." The words echoed through her mind like a drumbeat, over and over, until they became a chant, a mantra. What had she unleashed? Her heart began to race faster. The fear twisted inside her, turning her insides to liquid as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The ground beneath her feet shifted suddenly, and Emma's vision spun. The thick darkness began to dissolve, replaced by a new, horrifying sight. The blackness retreated, pulling away as though something was peeling back the veil between worlds. And what lay beyond it made Emma's blood run cold. She was no longer in the cabin. She was standing in the center of an ancient, decaying city, ruins stretching as far as her eyes could see. The structures around her were twisted, their architecture defying all reason. Walls that should have been straight leaned at unnatural angles, their surfaces covered in strange, alien symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly glow. The ground was cracked, as though it had been scorched by something catastrophic, and the air was thick with the scent of decay, like an open grave. There was no sky here, only a vast, swirling blackness above her head that seemed to move, swirling in on itself, as if it were alive. Her surroundings were so alien, so distant from anything she had known, that Emma felt her sense of reality slipping away, unraveling at the edges. "This is where we live," the voice said again, now clearer, stronger. "This is the place between places, the forgotten city that once was. And now you are here, with us." A shiver ran down Emma's spine as she looked around, realizing that the city wasn't as empty as it had seemed at first. There were figures in the distance, shadows moving just beyond her line of sight. Some were humanoid, while others were not. They lurked in the darkness, their forms too twisted and strange to fully comprehend. They were watching her as she stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the figures began to move toward her. She could hear the faint scrape of their feet against the cracked earth, the slithering of something wet and unnatural, the sound of breath, hot, ragged, as though they were getting closer. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered again, now almost a hiss. "You can never leave." Suddenly, Emma felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, and a deep, guttural rumble echoed through the air. The city was alive, alive with something ancient, something powerful. The whispering became a cacophony of voices, all of them speaking at once, their words a jumbled mess that made no sense. Yet somehow, it made her stomach churn. From the darkness, a figure emerged, a towering shape, almost too tall for her to comprehend. It stepped forward slowly, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, its movements jerky, like a puppet being controlled by some unseen hand. Its face was nothing more than a featureless mask, its eyes dark pits that seemed to consume all light, and its mouth, when it opened, revealed rows upon rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It stepped forward, its massive foot landing with a sickening thud on the ground, sending a shockwave through the city. The air shifted, warping, as if the figure's mere presence was enough to distort reality itself. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the creature, unable to look away, her body frozen in place by a mix of terror and fascination. The whispers reached a crescendo, and then, all at once, they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and then the creature spoke. "Welcome to the Hollow," it said, its voice a low, rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate through her very bones. "You've come to us, and now you will never leave." The ground trembled beneath her feet again, and Emma knew. This was no dream. This was no hallucination. She was trapped in a place beyond time, beyond reality, in the heart of something that had existed long before she ever set foot in the cabin. And she wasn't alone. The creature's voice reverberated through Emma's very being, sending shockwaves of terror through her body. "You've come to us, and now you will never leave." The words hung in the air like a curse, a sentence of eternal imprisonment. Emma wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to cooperate. Her legs felt like lead, her muscles frozen in place, her breath caught somewhere deep in her throat. The city around her had transformed into something unrecognizable, a twisted mockery of what it had once been. The buildings, now jagged and broken, seemed to lean inward as if closing in on her, suffocating her from all sides. She could hear the scraping sound of something dragging against the ground. Was it footsteps, or was it something worse? It was hard to tell in the unnerving silence that followed the creature's announcement. The figure before her loomed, like a god of some forgotten age, its towering form shifting unnaturally with every movement. The mask it wore was an abomination, featureless yet grotesque, with hollow black eyes that seemed to stretch into infinity. Each step it took made the ground shake beneath her, sending tremors through the broken streets. The closer it got, the more suffocating the air became, as if reality itself was bending around its presence. Emma's mind raced, struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. Her senses screamed at her to run, but her body betrayed her, locked in place like an insect in a spider's web. She could feel the oppressive weight of the creature's gaze as it studied her, a slow, deliberate scrutiny that made her skin crawl. She didn't know what it wanted, but deep in her gut, she knew it was bad, far worse than anything she could have imagined. The creature stopped just a few feet away from her, its face looming over her like the shadow of death. Its mouth opened, and the faintest whisper escaped from it, a voice so deep, so guttural, that it sounded like it was coming from the earth itself. "Do you feel it?" The voice rumbled, and Emma could taste the foulness of it on her tongue. The pull, the weight of the hollow calling to you. Her eyes flickered, her breath shallow and labored as her mind scrambled for some form of resistance. She tried to scream again, but nothing came out. Her throat was dry, constricted. Her eyes were wide with terror as she desperately fought against whatever invisible force was holding her in place. Every muscle in her body ached, her arms and legs stiff from fear and the unnatural stillness that surrounded her. "You belong to the Hollow now," the creature continued, its voice a dissonant melody of malice and ancient hunger. "The city claims all who enter. You will become one of us. You will become a whisper in the dark." Emma's heart pounded, a frantic rhythm that echoed in her ears. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs remained immovable. The creature's words clawed at her, filling her with dread she had never known before. She thought of the cabin, of the mirror that had led her here, of the strange presence that had first stirred when she made the fatal mistake of looking into it. Was this some kind of alternate dimension? A place where the laws of nature and reality no longer applied? No. Her voice was weak, barely a whisper, but it was enough. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if intrigued by her resistance. It took another step closer, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. In its presence, the very air seemed to vibrate with a strange energy, like an ancient power that had not been seen by human eyes in millennia. "You are afraid," it said, its tone almost mocking. "You are scared, but it will pass. Soon, you will forget fear. just as you will forget who you once were. The hollow has a way of consuming all that you were, to make you one of us. Suddenly, the ground beneath Emma's feet cracked open, splitting down the center like the maw of some great beast. The sound was deafening, a violent tearing that made her stomach lurch. She stumbled backward, her body finally reacting, but she could barely keep her balance as the earth trembled violently around her. The air thickened, turning viscous, like the atmosphere was turning into something alive, something hungry. From the cracks in the ground, shadows began to rise. At first, they were vague, shapeless masses, things that moved and twisted, impossible to describe. But as they grew, taking form, Emma realized with growing horror that they were people. Their faces were distorted and hollow, their skin stretched tight over their skulls. Their eyes were dark voids, and their mouths, gaping wide, were filled with jagged, razor-sharp teeth. Their arms hung limply at their sides, their bodies hunched forward as they shuffled toward her, their movements jerky and unnatural. "You're not alone here," the creature whispered. "This is what happens to those who stray too far from the world of the living. We are the forgotten, those lost between worlds, cursed to walk this forsaken city for eternity." Emma's breath hitched, her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but it was futile. The air felt thicker now, as though it were becoming harder and harder to breathe. The figures shuffled closer, their eyes locked on her, drawn to her like magnets. She could hear the sound of their feet dragging across the cracked ground, the wet slithering of their movements as they closed in. "Don't fight it," the creature warned. "You cannot escape the hollow. You are here now. Forever." Emma stumbled back, tripping over the uneven ground. Her pulse raced as the shadows reached out to grab her. Their cold fingers brushed against her skin, sending icy tendrils of dread spiraling through her body. Every inch of her wanted to run, but she couldn't. The shadows surrounded her, encroaching on all sides. The city seemed to come alive around her, groaning, shifting as though the very walls themselves were alive, responding to the presence of the creatures that now crowded the streets. The figures reached for her, their fingers like claws, scraping against the air. Emma could feel her heart in her throat, her body shaking with terror. She was surrounded by them, trapped in this living nightmare, and there was no way out. "Please, no," she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't belong here. I need to go back." But the hollow had no mercy. One of the figures, a tall, gaunt shape with an elongated face, reached out for her. Its fingers curled around her wrist with a grip that was bone-crushingly cold, its nails sharp like talons. Emma screamed, trying to pull away, but it was futile. The creature's strength was far beyond human. In the distance, a low, resonant hum began to build, a sound so deep, so primal, that it seemed to vibrate through the very core of the city. The ground shook again, and Emma's knees buckled beneath her as she was dragged toward the center of the street. The city, the hollow, was alive, and it was hungry. Emma felt as though the earth beneath her was a living thing, pulling her down into the depths. The hollow hum of the city, no longer just an eerie background noise, began to pulse with an almost sentient force, each beat reverberating through her chest like a warning, like an invocation of something older than time itself. The thing, the creature that had come for her, that had drawn her into this place, stood above her like a grim sentinel, watching her struggle against the grasp of the shadowed figures that continued to close in. The figure that had spoken to her, that had claimed her, seemed to tower even higher now, its presence growing as the shadows circled, feeding off her terror. Emma's heart pounded in her chest like a frantic animal, trying to escape a predator it couldn't see. The cold grip around her wrist tightened, pulling her deeper into the void, dragging her closer to the center of the hollow, where the ground opened like a maw, waiting to consume her. The figures, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of hunger and despair, continued their relentless approach. Their eyes, dark and endless, pierced through the shadows, each one seeming to promise nothing but torment. Emma tried to scream again, but her voice was nothing more than a breathless rasp, barely audible over the growing rumble of the earth itself. The air was thick now, heavy with a sense of inevitability, as if the very atmosphere was alive, aware of the end that was coming. Every time she thought she might escape, the shadows closed in tighter. Their cold hands reached out for her, their fingers clawing and scraping at the air. Emma struggled, her body shaking uncontrollably as she tried to wrench herself free. She fought with everything she had left, but it was as if the very city itself was holding her in place, rooting her to the spot. Her legs buckled beneath her, and the world around her blurred as the darkness seemed to swallow everything whole. "It's pointless," the voice of the creature rumbled, the words vibrating deep within her chest. "You cannot fight what you have already become. The hollow claims all who enter. You belong to it now." The words echoed in her mind like a mantra. No matter how hard she fought, how desperately she tried to escape, it was clear. She was trapped. There was no way out. The realization hit her like a physical blow, her heart sinking in her chest. She was no longer a visitor here. She was part of the hollow, and it would never let her go. The figures that surrounded her, their faces now only inches from her own, began to speak in a language she didn't understand. Their words were low and guttural, a chorus of voices that merged into one terrible song. The sound was alien and ancient, as if they were trying to communicate with something beyond her comprehension. Their eyes never left her, their hollow gazes unblinking, filled with something that could only be described as hunger. Her throat tightened, the fear gnawing at her insides. She could feel the cold tendrils of their presence slipping into her thoughts, warping her sense of reality. Everything around her seemed to blur and warp, the edges of the world beginning to dissolve like mist under the rising sun. The shadows seemed to move on their own now, undulating like a living, breathing thing. In the distance, something stirred. A low, ominous growl rumbled from deep within the hollow, growing louder with each passing second. Emma's eyes darted toward the source of the noise, her heart pounding with dread. It was then that she saw it, the thing that had been watching her from the shadows, lurking just beyond her sight. It was massive, a hulking mass of darkness that seemed to stretch on forever, its form indistinct, shifting like smoke in the air. The creature that stood before her, the one that had led her into this nightmare, turned its head toward the approaching thing, its expression unreadable. The figure seemed to know exactly what was coming, and Emma could feel the tension in the air grow thicker, more suffocating. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't something she could face alone. But then the creature spoke, its voice as cold and final as death itself. "Do not fear," it said, its voice dripping with an eerie calm. "It is too late for that." Emma's legs shook uncontrollably, and she stumbled forward, trying to gain some semblance of control over her own body. The world around her seemed to warp and distort, as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. And then, just as she thought she might lose herself entirely, something incredible happened. A thin, bright light broke through the darkness, casting its glow across the landscape like a beacon of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Emma hesitate. The figure in front of her, no longer a towering, insurmountable presence, was now something almost tangible, something she could touch. A surge of desperation coursed through her veins as the shadows closed in, threatening to consume her. She had to get to the light. She had to escape. The figures around her paused for a moment, as if sensing her resolve. The air around them seemed to thrum with an ominous energy, the earth beneath their feet shaking in response. And then, in a motion too quick to comprehend, the figure in front of Emma lunged toward her, its hand outstretched, its fingers long and skeletal, its touch cold as death itself. Emma's body moved instinctively, fueled by the primal fear that coursed through her. She twisted away from the creature, pushing herself forward, her legs burning with effort as she sprinted toward the light. Every muscle screamed in protest, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she was so close. The ground beneath her shifted again, but this time, she was prepared. She leaped over the chasm that had opened in the earth, her heart racing as she closed the distance to the light. The figures behind her wailed, a sound so high-pitched and unearthly that it cut through the air like a blade. But Emma didn't look back. She couldn't. She reached the light, her fingers brushing against its warmth. It was different from everything else around her, something pure, something that didn't belong in this world of darkness and decay. But as soon as she touched it, the ground beneath her gave way, and Emma felt herself falling. For a brief moment, everything went silent. Then, everything went black,